Hey guys, tonight, we begin with something warm, buttery, and slightly dishonest. Not dishonest in a wicked way. No kings are being poisoned over breakfast, and no baker is hiding state secrets beneath a pile of flour. But the croissant, that golden little crescent so closely tied to Paris, has been carrying around a rather complicated passport. So if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history, feel free to subscribe or leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from. For now, dim the lights, settle into something comfortable, and allow the room around you to grow a little quieter. Because tonight, we are going to follow the smell of warm bread backward through time. And strangely enough, we are not beginning in France. Congratulations. You have just arrived in Vienna in the year 1683. It is very early in the morning, far too early for breakfast. The sky above the city is a dull blue-black, and the streets are almost empty. The stones beneath your feet are damp. Somewhere nearby, rainwater drips slowly from a wooden roof. There are no elegant Parisian cafes here, no white porcelain plates, and certainly no waiter placing a neat croissant beside a cup of coffee. Instead, Vienna smells of smoke, horses, wet timber, human sweat, and bread. Mostly bread. That last smell comes from somewhere beneath street level. A baker is already awake. This is not unusual. Bakers live by a strange clock. Long before merchants lift their shutters, before priests begin their morning duties, and before respectable citizens decide that consciousness is necessary, bakers are working beside their ovens. You can imagine descending a few worn steps into one of these bakeries. The room is warm enough to make your face flush. Flour hangs faintly in the air. A wooden table stands beneath a small window. Dough rests beneath cloth. The baker's hands are pale with flour, his sleeves rolled above his wrists. There is soot near the oven and sweat along his forehead. Outside, however, Vienna is waiting for something far less comforting than breakfast. An Ottoman army surrounds the city. The Siege of Vienna has become one of the great dramatic episodes of European history. Although for the ordinary person trapped behind the walls, there is very little romance in it. Food is becoming precious. Disease is a constant worry. People sleep badly. Cannons interrupt prayers. Rumors move through narrow streets faster than carts. The Ottoman Empire, ruled at this time by Sultan Mehmed IV, stretches across enormous territories. Its armies have pushed deep into Central Europe, and Vienna now stands in their path. Beyond the walls are tents, horses, soldiers, cooking fires, weapons, and the low, restless noise of an army waiting. Inside are frightened families trying to continue with life. Someone still has to fetch water, someone still has to mend boots, someone still has to bake bread, and this is where our croissant begins to emerge from the fog. Or, more accurately, where one of the most famous stories about it begins. According to a popular legend, Ottoman soldiers attempt to tunnel beneath Vienna's defenses during the siege. They work underground at night, hoping to approach unnoticed. But there is a problem. Bakers are awake at night. While most citizens sleep, the bakers are already kneading dough and heating ovens. In the silence beneath the streets, they supposedly hear the strange sounds of digging. They alert the defenders. The plot is discovered. Vienna survives. And afterward, grateful citizens allow the bakers to create a special bread shaped like the crescent associated with the Ottoman world. The people of Vienna can now symbolically devour their defeated enemy for breakfast. It is a wonderful story. Perhaps a little too wonderful. History has an irritating habit of becoming less tidy when you inspect it closely. There is no solid evidence that a heroic baker heard Ottoman tunneling and immediately invented the ancestor of the croissant. Versions of the tale appear long after the events themselves, and similar legends become attached to other foods and other moments, yet the story survives because it feels right. The crescent shape already existed in Austrian baking traditions. A family of pastries known as kipferl had been eaten in Central Europe long before the famous siege. The word refers to a curved or crescent-shaped baked good, and forms of kipferl may reach back centuries. Imagine one on the table before you. Do not expect the delicate croissant you know today. It is likely denser, simpler. more like bread or a firm roll than the brittle, buttery cloud that leaves flakes all over your shirt at breakfast. There is no miraculous honeycomb of laminated dough inside. No countless paper-thin layers created by folding butter through dough again and again. This is an ancestor, not an identical twin, and that distinction matters. Foods rarely appear in history fully formed. They wander, they borrow, they change clothing. They cross borders with soldiers, merchants, servants, migrants, royal marriages, and ordinary families. A recipe that begins in one village may become fashionable in another kingdom. An ingredient associated with poverty can become luxurious. A foreign dish can be adopted so completely that generations later, everyone forgets it was ever foreign. The croissant is a particularly beautiful example, for now, however, you are still in Vienna. And there is a siege outside. The summer has been long and frightening. Ottoman forces arrived near Vienna in July, and the defenders have spent weeks watching their situation become increasingly desperate. The city walls are battered, explosions shake buildings, supplies decline. If you were an ordinary resident, the great political questions of Europe might feel distant. You are probably more interested in whether there will be bread tomorrow. Perhaps you stand in line holding a small cloth bag. Perhaps the person ahead of you complains quietly about prices. Perhaps a child nearby is crying. Your great-grandfather's great-grandfather somewhere in Europe might have known mornings rather like this. Uncertainty outside the door, smoke in the air, and the stubborn routine of preparing food anyway. That is one of the quieter truths of history. Empires rise dramatically. Breakfast continues. By September, relief forces approach Vienna. The battle that follows becomes famous. A coalition of Christian forces confronts the Ottoman army, and the siege is broken. Later generations decorate the event with stories. There are heroic cavalry charges. There are abandoned sacks of coffee. There are clever bakers. There are crescent-shaped pastries created in celebration. Some details are grounded in evidence. Others drift somewhere between memory and folklore, but the kipferl remains small, curved, Austrian, and decidedly not French. If you picked one up in Vienna and announced that you were holding a modern French croissant, the baker would probably stare at you. Then he might tell you to stop talking and eat before it gets cold. And perhaps that is the first quiet surprise of tonight's journey. France does not invent the crescent. France inherits it. The familiar shape already has a life before Paris gives it layers of butter, elegance, café tables, and an international reputation. For the moment, the future croissant is still a humble traveler waiting to begin its journey west. And somewhere beyond Vienna, roads stretch toward German lands, Flanders, and eventually Paris. The ovens are cooling, morning has finally arrived. The siege will become history. The legends will grow sweeter with every retelling, and the little crescent-shaped bread will survive them all. The little crescent does not hurry toward France. History almost never travels in a straight line. It moves with people, and people are forever stopping. They marry, they change jobs, they cross rivers, they lose money, they inherit shops, they join armies, they follow relatives into unfamiliar towns. Sometimes they carry recipes with them, written carefully on paper. More often, they carry those recipes in their hands. A baker remembers how dough should feel beneath the palm. A mother remembers how much flour her own mother used. A servant remembers the smell coming from an aristocratic kitchen. And so slowly, quietly, the kipferl moves through Central Europe. For generations, there is nothing especially French about it. If anything, the story remains stubbornly Austrian. You might imagine leaving Vienna on a cold morning, long after the Ottoman tents have disappeared from the horizon. The city has repaired itself. Merchants once again argue over prices. Church bells roll above the rooftops. Bakers still wake before dawn. On a wooden counter sits a curved roll. It is familiar now, ordinary. Nobody points at it and announces that they are witnessing the birth of a global culinary symbol. This is another habit of history. The things that later become famous often begin as things nobody bothers to describe. A king receives pages of careful documentation about his dinner. A baker's breakfast may leave almost nothing behind. So historians follow crumbs. They look through cookbooks, household accounts, newspaper advertisements, Letters, menus, paintings, business records, and dictionaries. They compare words. They examine when a particular food begins appearing in one city and when it becomes common in another. And when we do this with the croissant, the road begins to lead away from the romantic siege story. It also leads toward a young Austrian woman whose name has become attached to almost every convenient French food legend imaginable. Marie Antoinette. But we should not give her the croissant just yet. She has already been blamed for enough. Before we reach Versailles, there is something important to understand about European food. People have always borrowed from one another. Modern national borders can make the past seem much tidier than it really was. We like to imagine French food sitting neatly inside France, Austrian food inside Austria, English food inside England, and everything staying politely in its own kitchen. The people of the past did not cooperate with this idea. Merchants moved between cities, soldiers returned home carrying unfamiliar tastes. Aristocratic families married across borders, cooks changed employers, craftsmen migrated when wages were better elsewhere, ports connected distant markets. A spice arriving through Venice might eventually reach a kitchen in London. Wine from France could be consumed in Edinburgh. English wool travelled toward Flanders. Cornish tin entered trade networks stretching far beyond Cornwall. Food moved along the same roads. And somewhere along those roads travels the idea of crescent-shaped bread. By the 18th century, France is already one of Europe's great centres of culinary prestige. Paris is crowded, noisy, filthy, magnificent, hungry, and obsessed with status. Bread is not a decorative part of life, it is life. For ordinary people, the price and availability of bread can determine whether a week feels tolerable or terrifying. Imagine walking through Paris early in the morning. The streets are narrower than the grand boulevards that later generations will know. Waste gathers in unpleasant places. Wheels scrape against stone, shop signs hang over the street, horses leave steaming evidence of their passage. Then, through all of this, comes the smell of baking bread, warm flour, toasted crust, a little smoke. Perhaps that smell reaches you before you see the bakery. You join a queue. The person behind you is impatient. The woman ahead counts her coins twice. This bread is not a charming accessory beside coffee. It is a major part of the day's calories. The difference is important because the croissant, as we understand it now, belongs to a later kind of breakfast culture. Butter is expensive. Fine white flour is expensive. Labor is expensive. A pastry that requires careful folding, chilling, rolling, and more folding is not the obvious food of a poor laborer who needs something cheap and filling before sunrise. The modern croissant needs a particular world to develop around it. A world of skilled specialist bakers, a world of urban customers with money to spend, a world in which breakfast can become fashionable. That world is coming, but it has not arrived yet. Instead, France has its own breads, cakes, buns, pastries, and regional traditions. Some are rich with butter, some are sweetened, some contain eggs. Others are plain enough to accompany soup. If you travel from Paris toward Normandy, the butter changes. If you continue toward Brittany, local habits shift again, move south, and different fats, grains, fruits, and flavors enter the kitchen. There is no single French table, there never has been. The same is true in Austria. And this is why asking who invented a food can become surprisingly difficult. What exactly counts as invention? Is it the person who creates the shape, the person who changes the dough, the person who adds butter? The baker who makes it commercially successful, the city that makes it fashionable, or the country that eventually becomes inseparable from its image? With the croissant, each answer points toward a different place. The shape points east. The technique points elsewhere. The fame points directly toward Paris. For a while, however, the crescent remains associated with the German-speaking world. The French will eventually use the term viennoiserie for a family of baked goods connected, at least in style and historical memory. With Vienna, the word itself quietly preserves the foreign connection. Viennoiserie, things of Vienna. Today the category includes pastries that seem perfectly at home behind the glass of a Paris bakery. Yet the name whispers that something travelled. Imagine a recipe as a traveller arriving at a border. It carries no passport. It changes its coat, it learns a few local words, years pass. Nobody remembers exactly when it arrived. Eventually, the traveller's grandchildren insist they have always lived there. The croissant will undergo something like this. But before French bakers transform it, the crescent acquires another story. This one has silk dresses, palace corridors, powdered hair, and an unfortunate queen. Marie Antoinette arrives in France as an Austrian archduchess in the 18th century. She is young, very young. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI is not merely romantic, because royal marriages rarely have the luxury of being merely romantic. It is diplomacy made flesh. Austria and France have long histories of rivalry, suspicion, war, and shifting alliances. A marriage can tie political interests together in a way that treaties sometimes cannot. So the Austrian girl travels west. With her come attendants, habits, memories, preferences, anxieties, and tastes from home. Later generations will claim that one of those tastes is the kipferl. The story is wonderfully easy to tell. The Austrian princess misses her favorite crescent-shaped pastry. French bakers reproduce it for her. The court discovers it. France falls in love. The croissant is born. Once again, we have a problem. It is probably not true. At least there's no convincing evidence that Marie Antoinette introduces the croissant to France. The legend survives because it gives the pastry a famous mother. History likes famous parents. They make stories easier. Instead of describing decades of migration, commercial baking, changing techniques, urban tastes, and cultural exchange, you can simply point toward a queen and say, she brought it. Much cleaner, much less accurate. Marie Antoinette becomes particularly useful for this kind of legend because she is Austrian and French at the same time, at least in the public imagination. She forms a human bridge between Vienna and Versailles. If an Austrian pastry becomes French, surely the Austrian queen must have carried it across. But foods do not need queens to travel. They have bakers, they have merchants, they have servants, they have ordinary migrants looking for work. And those quieter people usually leave fewer letters behind. So the queen receives the legend. The baker disappears. By the early 19th century, however, something much more concrete begins to happen. Paris becomes increasingly interested in Viennese baking. And now our crescent finally approaches the city where it will be transformed. Picture Paris again, but this time the streets belong to a new century. Political revolutions have shaken France, kings have fallen and returned. Napoleon has risen, conquered, and vanished from power. Europe has been rearranged by armies and treaties. Yet beneath these enormous events, people continue eating breakfast. Coffee houses flourish, urban life changes, shop windows become more important. Foreign styles can become fashionable precisely because they are foreign. Paris has always possessed a remarkable appetite for taking an outside influence, refining it, naming it beautifully, and making the rest of the world associate it with France. In the late 1830s, an Austrian entrepreneur named August Zang opens a Viennese bakery in Paris. This matters. Zhang's establishment sells Austrian-style breads and pastries to Parisian customers. Among the products associated with this Viennese tradition is the kipferl. Now the crescent is no longer merely drifting west through vague culinary influence. It has a shop, it has customers, it has visibility. Parisians encounter Viennese baking as something fashionable and distinctive. French bakers notice. And French bakers do what skilled craftspeople have always done when they see something customers enjoy. They imitate it, then they change it. This is where the croissant begins becoming truly French. Not because France invents the crescent shape. Not because a queen demands a childhood snack. Not because victorious Viennese bakers celebrate an Ottoman defeat, but because French bakers take an existing Central European idea and gradually rebuild it using their own techniques. The dough changes. Butter becomes increasingly important. The pastry becomes lighter, flakier, more delicate. Over time, the old kipferl and the emerging French croissant begin to look like relatives who have lived in different countries for so long that they no longer dress alike. One is the ancestor, the other is becoming something new. This transformation does not happen in a single glorious morning. There is no known baker who wakes before dawn, folds butter into dough, pulls a perfect modern croissant from the oven, and declares history complete. Instead, the change unfolds gradually. That may sound less dramatic, But perhaps it is more beautiful. Thousands of hands contribute. Someone adjusts the flour. Someone changes the amount of butter. Someone rolls the dough thinner. Someone discovers that customers prefer a lighter texture. Someone else copies that improvement. A technique spreads from bakery to bakery. By the time people begin thinking of the croissant as obviously French, the process that created it has become difficult to see. Only the crescent remains as a clue, a curved shadow of Vienna. So when you sit at a café in Paris, perhaps not far from streets where generations of bakers worked before sunrise, and you tear open a warm croissant, you are holding two histories at once. The shape remembers Central Europe. The layers remember French craftsmanship. Its identity belongs not to a single dramatic invention, but to migration. And that is the reflective little twist hidden beneath all those crumbs. The croissant is French. It is also not entirely French. Both statements can be true. History often becomes more interesting when we allow it to hold two truths at once. For now, leave the last flakes of pastry on the plate. The morning is growing warmer. Somewhere nearby, coffee is being poured, and that dark, bitter drink has traveled even farther than our crescent-shaped bread. Let us leave the flour-covered bakery behind and follow its aroma into the streets, because the next part of our journey begins not with butter, but with a cup whose history connects Ottoman soldiers, Viennese merchants, European coffee houses, and another legend that refuses to die. Let us leave the flour-covered bakery behind and follow the darker fragrance drifting through the morning streets. It is the smell of roasted coffee. At first, it seems almost too convenient. A crescent-shaped pastry with an Austrian past sits beside a dark drink with deep connections to the Ottoman world. Together, they will eventually become such a familiar European breakfast that it is difficult to imagine one without the other. Yet neither begins in Paris, and neither arrives in Europe by a simple road. So we drift back toward Vienna, where the streets still remember war. The year is 1683. The Ottoman siege has ended. Morning settles over a landscape that only recently belonged to armies. Beyond the battered defences of Vienna, abandoned equipment lies among churned earth. Horses move between exhausted soldiers, broken carts stand where they were left. Cooking fires have faded into grey ash. The great Ottoman camp, once alive with thousands of voices, has been abandoned in haste. And armies, when they retreat quickly, leave things behind: weapons, tents, tools, food, animals, personal possessions, and, according to one famous story, mysterious sacks filled with small brownish beans. Imagine finding one. You crouch beside a rough cloth sack and loosen the cord. Inside are hard little objects you do not recognize. They do not smell especially remarkable. Perhaps someone beside you guesses that they are animal feed. Another man shrugs. Someone suggests throwing them away. This would be unfortunate, because those unimpressive little objects are coffee beans. Or so the legend tells us. The hero of this particular tale is usually a man named Georg Franz Kolschitsky. His biography changes depending on who is telling the story, which is often a warning sign when history becomes unusually entertaining. Kolschitsky is described as a soldier, interpreter, merchant, messenger, or some combination of these things. He is said to understand Ottoman language and customs after spending time in lands controlled by the empire. During the siege, according to the traditional account, he performs a daring mission. Disguised in Ottoman clothing, he slips through enemy lines carrying messages between Vienna and the approaching relief forces. It is a marvelous image. A lone man moving through darkness, enemy tents around him, the smell of horses and campfires. Voices in a language he understands. One mistake could mean death. He passes through safely. Vienna is eventually relieved, and afterward the grateful authorities reward him. Among the unwanted objects left behind by the Ottoman army are sacks of coffee. Nobody wants them. Kolschitsky does. He knows exactly what they are. He takes the beans, opens a coffee house, and teaches Vienna how to drink coffee. Some versions go further. They claim he adds milk to soften the bitter taste. Others give him sugar. Still others place a crescent-shaped pastry beside the cup, creating in one perfect scene the Viennese breakfast that will echo through European café culture. It is almost suspiciously neat. One heroic man, one siege. One abandoned supply, one coffee house, one breakfast. History rarely behaves so politely. The problem is that Vienna appears to have had coffee houses connected to other figures, particularly merchants from the Ottoman and Armenian worlds. Documentary evidence points away from the simple story that Kolschitsky single-handedly introduces coffee to the city. Coffee is already moving through Europe by trade. Vienna is not sealed away from the wider world. Venice has encountered coffee through its commercial links with the Eastern Mediterranean. Coffee houses are appearing in England and elsewhere. Merchants understand the value of this strange drink long before Viennese legend assigns it to one heroic messenger. Still, Kolschitsky becomes part of the city's mythology, and perhaps that tells us something useful. People do not only preserve what happened, they preserve the kind of story they want to tell about what happened. A city that survives a frightening siege naturally enjoys stories in which clever citizens transform the enemy's abandoned goods into everyday pleasures. The crescent becomes breakfast, the coffee becomes refreshment, war becomes a café table. There is something almost comforting about the transformation. The objects associated with danger are domesticated. They are placed on porcelain, sugar is added. You can sit down, no cannon fire, no walls trembling, just steam rising from a cup. But coffee itself has traveled a much longer road before reaching Vienna. To follow it, we must move south and east. Far from the cold mornings of Central Europe, coffee becomes deeply connected with the Arabian Peninsula. The plant has older roots in the highlands of Ethiopia. But the history of coffee as a cultivated drink becomes especially important in Yemen. By the 15th century, coffee is being consumed in the Islamic world. Sufi communities are often associated with its early use. The drink helps people remain awake during long periods of nighttime devotion. This is perhaps one of history's most understandable discoveries. Human beings find a substance that makes staying awake easier. Religious scholars use it, workers use it, travelers use it. Soon, everyone begins arguing about whether it is good for you. Very little has changed. Coffee spreads. From Yemen, it moves through ports and trading networks. It reaches cities such as Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople. Coffee houses appear. These places become socially important in ways that worry authorities. Men gather, they talk, they play games, they hear news, they discuss politics, they listen to stories and music. A room full of awake people talking to one another has always made certain rulers nervous. At different moments, attempts are made to restrict or ban coffee houses. The drink survives, of course it does. You can imagine the scene inside an Ottoman coffee house. The room is dim. Small cups are placed before customers. The coffee is dark and strong. There is no enormous mug filled with sweet syrup and whipped cream. No hurried paper cup carried through a railway station. You sit, you drink slowly. Conversation matters as much as the beverage. Smoke may hang in the air. A storyteller speaks from one corner. Wooden boards creak. Someone laughs. Someone else argues. A merchant has heard news from another city. A traveler describes a road you have never seen. Coffee creates a reason to remain in the room, and this social quality travels with it. When coffee reaches European cities, people do not merely adopt a foreign drink, they adopt the institution around it, the coffee house. London becomes especially enthusiastic. By the later 17th century, coffee houses are places where merchants, writers, political thinkers, businessmen, and professional men gather. Different establishments develop different reputations. One attracts merchants, another attracts people interested in politics, another becomes associated with literature. Information circulates over cups of coffee. In an age before instant communication, a crowded coffee house can function almost like a living newspaper. You enter knowing very little. You leave having heard 5 rumors, 2 arguments, the price of a commodity, news from a ship, and perhaps a deeply unreliable story about the king. Somewhere, somebody has probably also stolen your chair. Paris develops its own coffee culture. So does Vienna. But each city reshapes the habit. This is the same pattern we saw with the croissant. An imported thing arrives. Local people change it. Then, after enough time passes, the foreign object becomes part of local identity. In Vienna, coffee houses become places of remarkable cultural importance. They are not merely rooms where caffeine is sold. They become places where people read newspapers, write, debate, meet friends, conduct business, and spend long stretches of the day. A customer might order one coffee and remain for hours. The table becomes temporary property. The newspaper is shared. The waiter remembers faces. Outside, carriages move through the streets. Inside, time slows. Centuries later, writers, artists, musicians, intellectuals, and political figures will become closely associated with Viennese cafe life. But the foundations are laid gradually. No single abandoned sack creates all of this. Trade does, migration does, curiosity does, habit does. And perhaps a certain human desire to sit somewhere warm while discussing people who are not present. That desire appears to be eternal. Now imagine yourself at a small table. The cup before you is nothing like the coffee many people drink today. It may be thick, dark, bitter, sugar is valuable, and sweetness carries its own vast history of plantations, trade, wealth, and suffering. Milk may be added according to local taste. Preparation methods change, serving customs change. Europe takes coffee and begins adapting it to European preferences. At first, some people distrust the drink precisely because it is foreign. Coffee is associated with Muslim lands. This creates religious anxiety. A dark Ottoman beverage entering Christian Europe can become the subject of suspicion and rumor, yet usefulness has a remarkable ability to defeat cultural anxiety. Coffee tastes interesting. It keeps you awake. It gives people somewhere to gather. Soon, theological discomfort has to compete with the fact that everyone rather likes it. Stories later claim that Pope Clement VIII was asked to condemn coffee but tasted it and approved instead. Like many perfect historical anecdotes, the details should be treated cautiously. Still, the story survives because it captures something real. Coffee crosses boundaries faster than authorities can define them. Muslim drink, Christian drink, merchants drink, scholars drink, workers drink, luxury, habit, necessity. The labels keep changing, the cup remains, and as coffee becomes more common, something else happens. People want something to eat with it. Now our two wandering histories begin to approach each other again. The bitter drink and the crescent bread. Neither was born for the other, yet cultural habits have a way of arranging marriages. A warm pastry softens the bitterness of coffee. Coffee cuts through the richness of butter. The pairing feels inevitable only after generations make it familiar. In Vienna, baked goods and coffee become natural companions. In Paris, the same relationship develops within a different café culture. By the 19th century, the city is transforming rapidly. Parisian streets grow busier. Restaurants, cafés, bakeries, and public social life become central to the city's identity. The morning meal begins to acquire new possibilities for those who can afford them. Bread with butter, coffee, chocolate, pastries, a small luxury before the day's work. And once French bakers begin producing their own versions of Viennese pastries, the table is set for something new. The old Austrian kipferl is about to meet French dough technique. Coffee is waiting nearby. The crescent will become lighter. The butter will multiply. The crumbs will become impossible to control. And eventually millions of people will look at this combination and think of Paris. Not Vienna, not Yemen, not Constantinople. Not the Ethiopian highlands where the deeper botanical story of coffee begins. Paris. This is how cultural memory works. It often remembers the place where something became glamorous rather than the many places that made it possible. The cafe table hides the road, the porcelain cup hides the port, the pastry basket hides the migrant baker. The polished spoon hides the merchant ship. Yet if you sit quietly enough, those older worlds are still there. Inside the coffee is a journey through Africa, Arabia, Ottoman cities, Mediterranean trade, and European coffeehouses. Beside it, the crescent carries the memory of Central European ovens. A simple breakfast has become a map. And perhaps that is why ordinary food can tell history so gently. You do not need a battlefield, you do not need a crown. You need only ask why these particular things are sitting together on the table. The answer may cross continents. Morning now brightens beyond the Viennese windows. Someone opens a newspaper. A waiter carries another cup across the room. The door opens, allowing a brief ribbon of cold air inside. And somewhere in the city, A baker removes a tray from an oven. For a moment, coffee and crescent-shaped bread share the same warm room. Neither knows that Paris will one day claim the image. Neither knows that tourists centuries later will photograph their breakfast beneath striped awnings and believe they are participating in an entirely French tradition. But history has already begun arranging the table, and there is one more person waiting for us along the road to Paris. A young Austrian archduchess is preparing to leave the world she knows. Her destination is France. Her name will become synonymous with silk, scandal, revolution cake she probably never mentioned, and a croissant she almost certainly did not invent. So let us finish the coffee while it is still warm, then we will follow her west. The road west is long enough to make coffee seem like a very sensible invention. Before we follow the young archduchess toward France, however, remain in the coffee house a little longer. There is another transformation taking place here. It is quieter than a battle and slower than a royal marriage, but in some ways it will change everyday European life more deeply than either. People are learning how to spend time in public, not in a church, not in a market, not in a royal court, not merely in a tavern where beer and wine loosen the evening, but in a room built around conversation, newspapers, business, observation, and a bitter drink that makes everyone slightly more awake. The European coffee house becomes one of those ordinary institutions that seems obvious only after it exists. Imagine entering one in Vienna on a winter afternoon. You push open a heavy door, cold air follows you inside. Snow has melted along the edges of your boots, leaving dark marks on the floor. The room is warmer than the street, but not comfortably warm by modern standards. A stove gives off heat nearby. Candles burn on tables and in wall fixtures. Shadows gather in the corners. There is coffee in the air. There is also tobacco smoke, wet wool, leather, wax, ink, human beings. A great deal of history smells less elegant than paintings suggest. You remove your coat and find a place at a table. Perhaps a newspaper is available. This alone is significant. Printed information is becoming more common, and coffee houses help it circulate. One person reads aloud, another interrupts. A third claims the report is nonsense because his cousin has heard something completely different. Someone at the next table knows a merchant who has recently returned from Prague. A gentleman near the window has strong opinions about taxes. Nobody asked him. This does not stop him. The coffee house creates an audience. It also creates a strange kind of temporary equality. Not true equality, of course. European society remains deeply divided by wealth, gender, occupation, religion, and legal status. Many coffee houses are overwhelmingly male spaces. Servants and laborers do not suddenly become social equals of wealthy merchants simply because everyone is drinking from cups. But something unusual happens when information becomes part of the product. A man with news can become interesting even if he is not noble. A merchant may know more about distant events than an aristocrat. A traveler can command attention because he has seen places others have not. Knowledge itself begins to acquire social value. This is one reason governments occasionally look at coffee houses with suspicion. People are talking worse. They are talking to one another. And once people begin gathering regularly to exchange information, they sometimes develop opinions. Authorities have rarely found this reassuring. In England, King Charles II briefly attempts to suppress coffee houses during the 17th century. Partly because they are associated with political discussion and criticism, the effort fails. Coffee has already become too useful and too popular. The drink is doing something beer cannot do quite as well. It keeps the conversation awake. For much of European history, weak beer or ale is an ordinary part of daily consumption in many communities. Wine plays a similar role in other regions. These drinks provide calories and are woven into social life. Coffee introduces a different rhythm. You can drink it in the morning and then go to work. You can drink it during business. You can sit with documents and remain alert. The historian should be cautious about claiming that coffee somehow creates modern Europe. Human societies are rarely changed by one beverage. Still, the timing is fascinating. Coffee houses expand during centuries of growing commerce, printing, financial activity, scientific exchange, journalism, and urban public life. The cup fits the age. In London, certain coffee houses become closely associated with particular professions. Merchants interested in shipping gather in one place. Writers gather in another. Financial information circulates in rooms where coffee is served. The institutions that later become more formal sometimes grow from these repeated gatherings. A table can become a network can become a business. And a business can survive long after the original cups have been cleared away. In Paris, coffee takes on its own character. The French capital has no shortage of places to be seen. Cafés become social stages. People do not merely drink, they watch, they are watched. They discuss theatre, politics, literature, scandal, fashion, and whatever foolish thing a prominent person has done recently. In other words, Paris remains Paris. One establishment becomes especially famous, the Café Procope, opened during the late 17th century. Its rooms become associated with writers, intellectuals, and political figures. Later tradition links it with some of the most recognizable names in French cultural life. But imagine it before the names become famous. A chair scrapes across the floor, a spoon touches porcelain, a candle bends in a draught. A man leans over a table and makes an argument that feels extremely important to him. Across the room, nobody listens. History has not yet decided who matters. This is one of the pleasures of entering the past in imagination. We know the ending, they do not. A young writer can be merely an annoying young writer. A future revolutionary can be a man trying to find a seat. A famous philosopher can spill coffee on his sleeve. The marble statue has not yet hardened around the human being, and coffee, despite its exotic origins, becomes part of this ordinary European world. The foreignness fades. That fading is important. At first, people often describe imported foods by emphasizing where they come from. They are Turkish, Arabian, Italian, Austrian, Spanish, foreign, curious, strange. Then people become accustomed to them. The label weakens. Children grow up seeing the food on local tables. By the next generation, it feels normal. By the generation after that, someone becomes angry if you suggest it belongs anywhere else. The same process will happen to the croissant. But coffee gets there first. There is an irony in this. European powers of the 18th and 19th centuries increasingly try to control the production of commodities they once imported from elsewhere. Coffee cultivation spreads beyond its earlier centers. Colonial systems carry coffee plants to new regions. European demand grows, plantations expand. The gentle cup on a cafe table becomes connected to land, empire, forced labor, slavery, exploitation, and global trade. Sugar carries an even darker burden. The spoonful that makes bitter coffee pleasant may come from plantations where enslaved people endure brutal conditions. A wealthy Parisian stirring sugar into coffee can remain almost completely separated from the human cost hidden inside the cup. The café is elegant. The system supplying it is not. This is another reason ordinary objects make such revealing historical guides. A sword announces violence, a sugar bowl does not, yet both can belong to the same imperial world. For our sleepy journey tonight, we need not remain too long in those darker plantations, but we should not erase them either. The breakfast table is never isolated from the world that supplies it. Coffee requires growers, sugar requires labor. Porcelain requires craftsmen and trade. Butter requires cattle and pasture. Flour requires fields, mills, carts, and bakers. The smallest meal rests upon countless invisible hands. Perhaps you lift the cup now. The coffee is cooling. Outside the window, Vienna continues around you. A carriage rattles over the street. Somewhere, a church bell sounds. A servant hurries past carrying a parcel. A merchant pulls his coat tighter against the cold. You take another sip. The bitterness has softened. Maybe there is milk in it, maybe sugar. And perhaps beside the cup sits a small piece of bread. Not yet our modern croissant. We must resist the temptation to hurry history. The laminated French croissant belongs later. For now, imagine something closer to a kipferl, curved, firm. Golden at the edges, you tear off a piece. A few crumbs fall onto the table. The pairing works. That is enough. No one needs to invent the breakfast in one dramatic moment. People simply discover repeatedly that coffee and bread are pleasant together. Across Europe, morning customs vary enormously. A labourer may eat leftovers from the previous evening. A farmer may begin work before taking a substantial meal. A wealthy household may serve bread, butter, chocolate, coffee, meat, eggs, or other dishes depending on place and fashion. The idea of a standardized breakfast is still distant. Even the meaning of meals shifts through time. People eat at different hours. Meal names change. What seems natural to you would seem peculiar to many of your ancestors. You might want coffee immediately after waking. A medieval laborer might wonder why you are drinking an expensive foreign stimulant instead of eating something useful. He may have a point, but the new drink keeps spreading. Coffee crosses class boundaries, though quality and preparation vary. It becomes a habit. And habit is stronger than novelty. The first cup is exotic, the thousandth is breakfast. This is exactly what will happen when the Austrian crescent enters Parisian baking. At first, Viennese breads can be marketed as foreign. That foreign identity is part of their charm. Parisian customers are not embarrassed that the product comes from elsewhere. Quite the opposite. Vienna carries associations of refinement. Foreign baking can be fashionable. Then French bakers begin producing similar goods themselves. The imported style enters local technique. Eventually, the copy changes enough that it becomes its own thing. The child outgrows the parent. By the time the modern croissant emerges, most people eating one do not need to know anything about Austrian baking. They only need to know that it tastes good with coffee. And perhaps this is how cultures absorb one another most effectively. Not through official declarations, through appetite. You do not need a treaty to adopt somebody else's pastry. You do not need a royal marriage to enjoy their drink. You simply taste it, then you want it again. The merchants notice, the bakers notice, the café owners notice soon. There are more cups, more ovens, more customers. A foreign habit becomes profitable. Profit encourages repetition. Repetition creates tradition. Tradition creates memory, and memory eventually insists that things have always been this way, but now, outside our imaginary Viennese coffee house, a carriage is being prepared for a very different journey. We move forward from the 17th century into the 18th. Europe remains a patchwork of kingdoms, empires, principalities, duchies, free cities, bishoprics, and territories whose borders can make a modern map look almost mercifully simple. France is powerful. Austria is powerful. They have spent generations finding reasons to fight one another. Then diplomacy changes. Old enemies discover that new enemies can be even more inconvenient. Alliances shift. And as so often happens in royal Europe, a young woman is expected to help make the arrangement permanent. Her name is Maria Antonia. She is born in Vienna in the year 1755. She is a daughter of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. At home, she is surrounded by siblings, servants, tutors, music, ceremony, and the strange combination of privilege and obligation that defines dynastic childhood. She has beautiful clothes. She has palaces. She also has very little control over the largest decision of her life, her marriage. Royal daughters are political resources. Their hands can strengthen alliances. Their wombs can produce heirs. Their personal preferences are important only when they happen to align with diplomatic necessity. Maria Antonia is destined for France. She will marry Louis Auguste, heir to the French throne. She is still a teenager. Imagine the preparations: fabric, trunks, jewelry, documents, servants moving through rooms, instructions repeated, ceremonies planned. Every detail carries political meaning. She is not simply going abroad, she is being transformed. Even her name will change in French memory. Maria Antonia becomes Marie Antoinette. The Austrian girl is being remade for France. And this is exactly why the later croissant legend attaches itself so easily to her. She travels from Vienna to the French court. The pastry supposedly follows. It is almost irresistible as a story. The future queen misses the crescent-shaped bread of home. She asks French bakers to prepare it. The aristocracy copies her taste. The country adopts it. Austrian kipferl becomes French croissant, simple, elegant, wrong, or at least unsupported by good evidence. There is no reliable contemporary record showing Marie Antoinette introducing the croissant to France. There is no famous order from Versailles demanding trays of kipferl. No trustworthy diary entry announces that the Queen has revolutionized French breakfast. The story grows later, and it grows for a reason. Marie Antoinette becomes a magnet for food mythology. The most famous example, of course, is the line about letting starving people eat cake. She almost certainly never says it. Versions of the remark circulate before she could plausibly have made it. But the quotation fits the later image of her so perfectly that facts struggle to compete. The croissant legend works the same way. Austrian queen, Austrian pastry France, therefore she must be responsible. History is rarely defeated by logic. It is frequently defeated by a story that is easier to remember. Now imagine the young archduchess preparing to leave Vienna. Perhaps somewhere in the palace there is coffee. Perhaps somewhere in the city a baker shapes a kipferl. We cannot know whether she pauses over either. What we do know is that she is about to cross a border, not only between countries, but between identities. At the frontier, according to the elaborate customs surrounding royal marriage, the Austrian bride is symbolically separated from her former life. She must become French. Her clothing changes, her attendants change, her surroundings change. The message is unmistakable. The girl who entered the ceremonial space belongs to Austria. The girl who leaves it belongs to France. Of course, human identity is not so obedient. Memory crosses borders even when servants cannot. Taste crosses, accent crosses, childhood crosses. A person carries invisible luggage. Marie Antoinette will spend years being criticized precisely because many French people continue to see her as foreign. The Austrian woman, the outsider, the queen who does not quite belong. And later, long after her death, that foreignness will make her the perfect bridge in the invented story of the croissant. But before we reach the pastry myth, we must enter Versailles. The quiet coffee house fades behind us. The tables disappear. The newspapers close. The smell of roasting beans gives way to wax, perfume, polished wood, fireplaces, silk, powder, and crowded royal rooms. Let us leave the dark coffee in Vienna and follow the carriage west. The road stretches toward France. Inside sits a young girl who cannot know that centuries later people will accuse her of recommending cake she never recommended, and importing a breakfast pastry she almost certainly did not import. Ahead of her, Versailles waits. And Versailles is very hungry. Let us leave the dark coffee in Vienna and follow the carriage west, toward a palace where even breakfast can become political. The road to France is long. For Marie Antoinette, it is also a road away from childhood. The young archduchess travels through a Europe without railways, without smooth highways, and without any possibility of making the journey quickly. Carriages roll over uneven roads. Wheels sink into mud. Horses need rest. Inns vary from tolerable to deeply regrettable. A royal traveller enjoys greater comfort than almost anyone else, of course. There are servants, fresh horses can be arranged, meals can be prepared. Rooms can be reserved, but a carriage remains a wooden box on wheels, and European roads remain European roads. You can wrap the box in silk, the pothole does not care. Eventually, the Austrian princess reaches the carefully arranged ceremonial point where she is to be transferred into French hands. The symbolism is almost painfully clear. She must leave Austria behind. The ceremony takes place on neutral ground near the Rhine. A temporary structure is prepared. Marie Antoinette enters from one side as an Austrian archduchess. Her Austrian clothing is removed. Her Austrian attendants say goodbye. Even possessions associated with her former identity are left behind. She is dressed again according to French expectations. Then she exits from the other side. Now she belongs to France at least. That is the idea. The girl herself is only 14 years old. 14. Old enough to understand that everyone is watching. Young enough that the scale of what is happening must have felt unreal. She is expected to marry the heir to one of Europe's most powerful monarchies. She is expected to charm a foreign court. She is expected to represent an alliance between dynasties. Eventually, she is expected to produce children, preferably sons, and while doing all of this, she is expected to appear graceful. Royal women often live inside contradictions. Be visible but never improper. Be charming, but never too informal. Spend enough to represent royal magnificence, but not so much that people call you wasteful. Produce airs, but do not appear interested in the physical process required to produce them. Be foreign enough to symbolize an alliance. Be French enough that nobody remembers you are foreign. Marie Antoinette will never fully solve these contradictions. Perhaps nobody could. When she reaches the French court, she enters a world built around ritual. Versailles is enormous, beautiful, crowded, uncomfortable. It is easy to imagine the palace only as a series of glittering rooms, mirrors, chandeliers, gilded walls, painted ceilings, silk gowns. But Versailles is also a workplace, a residence, a political machine, and an extremely busy human environment. People live here, servants carry water, fires must be maintained, food travels through corridors, clothes require cleaning, chamber pots require attention, dogs wander where dogs probably should not wander, courtiers wait for opportunities to be noticed. Every doorway can contain someone hoping to improve his position. Privacy is scarce. Even waking up can become ceremonial. The future king's morning routine is observed according to rank and privilege. Access itself is a form of power. To be allowed into a royal room at the correct moment can matter politically. Imagine wanting only a quiet breakfast. Now imagine that breakfast exists inside a system in which the person permitted to hand you a garment may consider the act a hereditary privilege. This is Versailles. Food is part of the performance. Royal meals can be public events. Tables display abundance. Dishes arrive according to elaborate service traditions. Meat, fish, sauces, soups, breads, sweets, fruits, wines, and other foods announce wealth before anyone takes a bite. Yet Marie Antoinette's personal relationship with food becomes strangely distorted by later legend. People who know almost nothing else about her often know one sentence: "Let them eat cake." The line has become so attached to her that removing it feels almost like taking away part of her name, but there is no good evidence that she says it. The phrase is usually linked with a passage written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who describes a great princess responding to the lack of bread among peasants by suggesting brioche. The passage appears in a context that predates Marie Antoinette's position as the hated queen of revolutionary France. She is too young for the famous attribution to make sense, yet the quote survives. Why? Because it tells a complete story in a few words. The poor have no bread. The queen suggests luxury bread. Therefore, the queen does not understand the poor. It is almost perfect propaganda. Accuracy becomes secondary. And once Marie Antoinette acquires the reputation of a frivolous foreign queen surrounded by luxury, other food stories begin attaching themselves to her: cake, champagne, extravagant banquets, and eventually, croissants. The croissant story usually sounds harmless. As an Austrian girl, Marie Antoinette supposedly misses the kipferl of her homeland. She asks for it at Versailles. French bakers reproduce the pastry. The court develops a taste for it. The crescent spreads into French culture. It is charming. It is also difficult to support. If the future croissant truly enters French baking because of the queen, we might expect contemporary evidence. Royal households generate records. Court observers write letters. Servants notice habits. Food fashions leave traces. Yet historians do not find the kind of evidence needed to make Marie Antoinette the mother of the French croissant. The connection appears much more strongly in later storytelling than in the documents of her own lifetime. And there is another problem. Even if Marie Antoinette had eaten kipferl in France, the kipferl is still not the modern croissant. Remember the bread from Vienna: curved, simple, often denser. It does not yet possess the defining laminated structure of the French pastry. If you place an old-style kipferl beside a modern butter croissant, the family resemblance is visible mostly in the silhouette. The internal architecture is different. And architecture matters. A croissant is not merely dough bent into a crescent. If that were true, every curved bread roll in Europe could claim the name. What makes the familiar French croissant remarkable is the layering. Dough and butter are folded together repeatedly. The baker rolls the mass out, folds it, chills it, rolls it again. The process creates alternating layers. When the pastry enters the oven, water in the butter turns to steam. The layers separate. The dough rises. The outside becomes crisp and golden, while the interior forms delicate chambers. Tear one open while it is warm, and you can see the structure: thin walls, soft spaces, butter, steam. A small piece of edible engineering. This technique does not appear in the Marie Antoinette legend because it belongs to a later stage of the story. The queen can plausibly represent Austrian influence. She cannot explain the transformation that makes the croissant what it is. That work belongs to bakers, mostly anonymous bakers, which is less useful for mythology. A queen has a portrait, an unknown baker has flour on his sleeves. A queen has enemies, an unknown baker has dough that must be ready before sunrise. A queen can become the subject of films, paintings, biographies, gossip, and legend. A baker may leave behind only a business address. So history remembers the queen. The craft disappears into the background. But tonight, we can reverse that for a moment. Walk away from the grand rooms, leave the mirrors, leave the silk, leave the courtiers whispering behind fans. Go toward the working parts of the palace. The temperature changes, the smells change. There are kitchens, storerooms, servants' passages, fires, metal pans, knives, baskets, flour, grease, and people moving quickly. Royal luxury requires labor. A great table does not appear because a king is hungry. Someone carries the wood. Someone lights the fire. Someone plucks the bird. Someone kneads the bread. Someone scrubs the pan afterward. Behind every elegant historical meal stands an exhausted person hoping the important people stop eating soon. This is where food history becomes more honest, not at the table behind it. The court may set fashions, but cooks and bakers make those fashions physically possible. And beyond Versailles, France contains thousands upon thousands of ordinary kitchens. Most French people will never eat like the royal family. Their meals depend on region, season, income, harvest, occupation, and local custom. Bread remains central for poorer urban families. Changes in bread prices can be frightening. A failed harvest is not an interesting economic statistic. It is hunger approaching the door. By the late 18th century, France faces severe financial and social problems. The monarchy is deeply indebted. Taxation is unequal. Harvest difficulties worsen food insecurity. Bread prices rise. Political anger grows. In such a world, the image of a queen enjoying luxury becomes dangerous whether every story about her is true or not. Marie Antoinette becomes a symbol. Foreign, wasteful, detached. Her actual personality matters less and less. Symbols do not receive fair trials. Pamphlets attack her. Rumors multiply. Her spending becomes a public obsession. Her private life becomes material for scandal. Some accusations are political, others are sexual. Many are exaggerated or fabricated. But repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity begins to feel like truth. This is how the cake quotation survives. It feels like something the hated queen would say. Centuries later, the croissant story works in the opposite emotional direction. Now the foreign queen is no longer merely cruel. She is elegant, fashionable, a little tragic. She brings a charming Austrian pastry to France. The same historical figure is remodeled for a different audience. One legend condemns her through food. Another makes her glamorous through food. Neither needs strong evidence. Marie Antoinette herself cannot object. She is trapped inside the stories other centuries tell about her. For now, however, she is alive. Imagine her at Versailles before everything collapses. Perhaps morning light enters through tall windows. A servant brings chocolate or coffee. Bread may be present. Butter. Perhaps some kind of pastry. We should not place a modern croissant on the plate merely because we want the scene to look French. That would be too easy. Instead, let the plate remain uncertain. That uncertainty is more historically honest. Outside the palace, Paris grows restless. The distance between court ritual and ordinary hunger becomes politically explosive. In the year 1789, the French Revolution begins. The world Marie Antoinette entered as a teenage bride starts to disappear. Versailles loses its security. The royal family is eventually moved to Paris. The monarchy falls. Louis XVI is executed. Marie Antoinette follows him to the guillotine later that same year. She is 37 years old. The Austrian girl who crossed the border in silk dies as a prisoner of revolutionary France. And still, there is no modern croissant in her hands. The pastry that later generations connect so confidently to her has not yet completed its transformation. This may be the strangest part of the legend. Marie Antoinette dies before the strongest evidence for the popularization of Viennese-style baking in Paris. The most important commercial bridge in our story comes decades later. Not through Versailles, through a bakery, and that bakery belongs to an Austrian entrepreneur named August Zang, so perhaps we should allow the Queen to rest. She has carried enough false quotations. She does not need to carry breakfast as well. The palace grows dim behind us. The revolution passes. Years turn, governments change. Napoleon rises, Napoleon falls. France becomes a kingdom again. Then politics shifts again, as politics has an exhausting habit of doing. Paris survives all of it. The city eats. The city drinks coffee. The city wants bread. And somewhere in the 19th century, a Viennese businessman looks toward Paris and sees an opportunity. The next important step in the history of the croissant will not take place beneath a chandelier. It will happen behind a shop window. But before we enter that bakery, there is one final thing worth remembering about Marie Antoinette. She is useful to the croissant story precisely because she makes cultural exchange look simple. One woman travels from Austria to France. One pastry travels with her. Done. Reality is slower. Recipes migrate through communities. Techniques spread through professional imitation. Customers reward some experiments and ignore others. Ingredients become cheaper or more available. Tools improve. Tastes shift. A food changes a little in one bakery and a little more in another. Eventually, the original version can barely recognize its descendant. This process leaves no dramatic portrait. There is no single day to celebrate. No trumpet sounds when a recipe becomes a tradition. That is why we invent cleaner stories. We like beginnings. History usually gives us processes, and the croissant is a process shaped like a crescent. For the moment, the palace doors close behind us. The powdered courtiers fade. The queen disappears into memory and myth. Ahead, Paris enters a new century. Its streets are noisy with carts and conversation. Coffeehouses are busy. Bakers are awake before dawn, and soon a new shop will open, offering Parisians something advertised not as purely French, but proudly Viennese. The foreignness is part of the attraction. The crescent is about to return. This time, we have documents. This time, we have a businessman. And this time, France is finally ready to begin turning the Austrian kipferl into the pastry the world will one day call unmistakably French. The queen is gone, but the ovens remain. This may be one of the simplest ways to understand the strange durability of food. Kings die, governments collapse, borders move, palaces become museums. But somewhere, before sunrise, somebody still has to make the bread. Paris after the Revolution is not the same city Marie Antoinette first encountered as a teenage bride. It has watched crowds march through its streets. It has heard speeches, gunfire, church bells, military drums, and the scrape of carts carrying prisoners toward execution. It has seen a monarchy fall. It has seen a republic rise. It has seen terror. It has seen Napoleon. Then it has seen monarchy return. For ordinary Parisians, however, political history does not remove the daily problem of hunger. People wake, they work, they buy food, they complain about prices, they drink coffee when they can afford it. And every morning, bakeries open their doors. Imagine walking through Paris during the early 19th century. The city is still far from the Paris most visitors recognize today. The great transformation associated with broad boulevards and sweeping urban redesign lies ahead. Many streets remain narrow and crowded. Buildings lean over lanes where carts struggle past pedestrians. Rain turns dirt into mud. In summer, unpleasant smells rise from drains, animals, workshops, kitchens, and human waste. You hear iron-rimmed wheels striking stone. A knife grinder calls out his trade. A woman sells produce. A dog investigates something in the gutter that you would rather not identify. Above you, laundry hangs from windows. Then a bakery door opens. Warm air escapes. For a moment, the street smells better. This is the Paris into which foreign baking traditions arrive. Not a postcard, a living city. And living cities are hungry for novelty. The wealthy have always enjoyed foreign fashions. A cloth from another country can seem more desirable because it is difficult to obtain. A new sauce can become fashionable because a fashionable person serves it. A foreign word can make an ordinary object sound sophisticated. Food follows the same pattern. Vienna possesses a strong reputation for baking. Its breads and pastries carry associations of skill and refinement. So when Viennese-style baked goods become more visible in Paris, their foreign origin is not necessarily something to hide. It is part of the sales pitch. This is important because modern food nationalism can make us imagine that 19th century French customers would reject a pastry for not being French enough. Often the opposite is true. Foreignness can be fashionable. The question is whether the food tastes good. And the Viennese answer is increasingly yes. August Zhang enters our story here. He is Austrian. He is not the kind of figure most people expect to find standing near the supposed birth of the croissant. He is not a royal chef. He is not a starving Parisian baker who experiences a sudden flash of genius. He is an entrepreneur. He has interests beyond baking and will later become involved in journalism and other ventures. But for our purposes, the important moment comes when he establishes a Viennese bakery in Paris during the late 1830s. The establishment becomes known as the Boulangerie Viennoise, the Viennese bakery. Even the name announces that the products inside are foreign. Imagine approaching its window. You are a Parisian accustomed to familiar local breads. Behind the glass, however, you see goods associated with Vienna. Different shapes, different methods, different presentation. Perhaps the shop itself feels slightly exotic. Customers enter partly because they are curious. Curiosity is one of the great engines of culinary history. Someone tries something unfamiliar, then tells a friend. The friend returns, a competing baker notices the cue. Soon the unfamiliar thing is being copied. This is roughly the environment in which Viennese baking begins influencing Paris more visibly. The kipferl is part of that broader tradition. But we must remain careful. The product appearing in this period is not necessarily identical to the modern butter croissant. That distinction is easy to lose because our eyes recognize the crescent shape and want to finish the story immediately. There it is, we think. Croissant, case closed, but shape is only the beginning. The word croissant itself simply refers to the crescent form. French bakers can make crescent-shaped breads without using the laminated dough that later defines the pastry. Early French croissants are often made differently from the airy, flaky version now expected in a good bakery. Think again of the interior. A modern croissant contains layers. That is the secret. When you break one apart, it does not behave like ordinary bread. The outer shell cracks gently. Thin flakes fall. The inside stretches and separates into delicate sheets. There are pockets of air created by steam. The structure almost looks woven. This texture comes from technique, and technique requires labor. A baker begins with dough, butter is enclosed within it, then the dough is rolled, folded, chilled, rolled again, folded again. Temperature matters. If the butter becomes too warm, it melts into the dough instead of remaining in distinct layers. If it is too cold, it can break. The dough must cooperate, the butter must cooperate. The room itself can become an enemy on a hot day. There is something almost meditative about the process when described slowly. Roll, fold, rest, turn, roll again. Each movement creates future layers that are still invisible. Only inside the oven will the architecture reveal itself. This method belongs to the wider history of laminated dough, and French bakers developed their own approaches to it. Eventually, the crescent shape inherited from the Viennese tradition meets this French technique. That meeting is the moment that matters most, not one dramatic invention. A marriage, shape meets method. Austria meets France. The kipferl meets laminated dough. And the croissant begins to become the croissant. This is why saying that the croissant is not really French is both revealing and slightly mischievous. The ancestry is not purely French. But the modern form owes enormously important development to French bakers. If you remove Vienna from the story, the shape and cultural lineage become difficult to explain. If you remove France, the familiar modern pastry also disappears. It is a shared history that may be less satisfying than assigning ownership, but breakfast does not care about national pride. Breakfast wants butter, and French bakers are increasingly prepared to provide it. By the middle and later 19th century, Parisian baking becomes more specialized and competitive. Customers have choices. A baker who produces something especially attractive can gain a reputation. Appearance matters, texture matters, consistency matters, the shop window matters. Urban food becomes part necessity, part theatre. Imagine standing outside a bakery at dawn. The glass is slightly misted from warmth inside. A worker arranges fresh goods, loaves rest in rows, small breads fill baskets, perhaps crescent-shaped pastries sit nearby. You open the door, a bell sounds. The baker has already been working for hours. This is another part of the croissant story that the elegant café photograph hides. To give you a fresh pastry in the morning, somebody begins work in darkness. Flour arrives in heavy sacks. Butter must be handled carefully. Dough must ferment. Ovens must be heated. Trays must be moved. Tables must be cleaned. Hands become dry from flour, and washing backs ache. The beautiful breakfast depends upon an inconvenient schedule. This was true in Vienna. It is true in Paris. It remains true in bakeries today. There is a strange continuity in that. The baker is always awake before the customer. Perhaps this is why so many bread legends begin at night. The public sleeps. The baker hears the city differently. In the old Vienna story, he hears Ottoman soldiers digging beneath the walls. In reality, he probably hears carts, footsteps, animals, rain, and the ordinary noises of people who work while others sleep. Either way, the baker belongs to the hours before history looks polished, and during the 19th century, these workers slowly transform the Viennese crescent. There is no single morning we can identify as the moment everything changes. One bakery may use a richer dough. Another may experiment with butter. Another may copy a successful method. Customers begin expecting certain textures. Cookbooks and professional knowledge spread techniques. Names become standardized. The croissant gradually moves away from being merely a French version of an Austrian roll. It becomes a category of its own. By the early 20th century, recipes increasingly resemble what we would recognize as the modern laminated croissant. The transformation has taken decades. This is worth lingering over. We often talk about invention as if human beings create things in flashes. A light appears above someone's head. The inventor runs into the street. Everyone applauds. Real craft is usually slower. A baker changes one detail. Another improves it. A third discovers a better temperature. Someone else finds a more reliable butter. A customer prefers one version. The market rewards it. The method spreads. Eventually, nobody remembers who made the first improvement. The finished object receives a national identity. The anonymous hands disappear. That is the fate of many foods. Consider how medieval people cleaned clothes. There is no single inventor of washing. People use water, ash, lye, soap, beating, rinsing, sunlight, and countless local methods refined across generations. Or think of cheese, wine, bread itself. These are not single inventions in the modern sense. They are conversations between generations. The croissant belongs to that older pattern. One baker speaks through technique. Another answers. The conversation lasts decades, and eventually Paris becomes fluent. The city also becomes increasingly associated with café life. This matters because the croissant needs more than a bakery. It needs a setting, a ritual, a reason to be eaten. The Paris café gives it one. Imagine a morning table. Not yet the polished fantasy sold to tourists, but something recognizable: coffee, bread, perhaps butter, perhaps a pastry, a newspaper, street noise nearby. A person has somewhere to go, but is not going there quite yet. The croissant fits beautifully into this moment. It is rich, but not enormous. Sweet perhaps, but not necessarily dessert. It can be eaten with coffee. It can be torn apart by hand. It feels indulgent without requiring a formal meal. And, most importantly, it leaves crumbs everywhere. Some historical traditions survive because they are useful, others survive because they are delicious. The croissant has both advantages. Its crescent shape also makes it visually memorable. A round bun is merely a round bun. A crescent has personality. The shape carries history even when the eater does not know the history. By now, the old Ottoman siege legend begins to seem almost poetic again. Not factual in the simple form, but symbolically appropriate. The crescent has traveled through cultures that once met one another in war. Ottoman influence, Austrian memory, French craft, coffee from lands farther south and east, sugar from global trade, butter from European farms, wheat from fields that may lie only a few miles from the bakery or much farther away. Breakfast becomes an accidental monument to exchange. No one plans it. No committee declares that the croissant will represent centuries of cultural movement. People simply keep eating, and repetition does the rest. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette remains trapped in the legend. As the 19th century turns into the 20th, romantic stories about royal courts become increasingly attractive. The dead queen can be transformed into whatever later audiences require: villain, victim, fashion icon, tragic princess, careless aristocrat, misunderstood woman. And somewhere among these identities, pastry importer. The story becomes especially tempting because people already know she is Austrian. It sounds plausible. That is often enough for folklore. A good myth does not need to be proven. It needs to be repeatable. Marie Antoinette brought the croissant from Austria. You can say it in one breath. Now try the more accurate version. The croissant developed over a long period from Central European crescent-shaped baked goods, including the Austrian kipferl, with Viennese baking gaining visibility in 19th century Paris before French bakers gradually developed laminated versions that evolved into the modern pastry. Accurate. Useful, terrible at a dinner party. So the Queen wins, at least in popular memory. But tonight, we have time. There is no need to rush toward the neat version. We can remain with the uncertainty. We can smell the butter. We can watch the baker roll the dough. We can allow history to be complicated. Perhaps that is what these quiet nighttime journeys are best for. During the day, we want answers. At night, we can tolerate stories. And the story now moves away from Versailles for good. Marie Antoinette has served her role, not as the inventor of the croissant, but as a reminder of how easily famous names swallow anonymous history. The real transformation happens elsewhere, in workshops, in bakeries, behind steamed windows, on flower-covered tables, in the hands of people whose portraits were never painted. So now we move from palace corridors to the working streets of 19th century Paris. Morning has not yet broken. Gas lamps glow faintly through the mist. A cart carrying flour moves over wet stones. Inside a bakery, someone is already awake. He turns a block of butter onto dough. He folds one edge inward, then the other. He reaches for the rolling pin. There is no queen in the room, no army, no heroic legend, only flour, butter, patience and practiced hands. And perhaps this is where the croissant truly becomes French. Now we move from palace corridors to the working streets of 19th century Paris, where history begins before sunrise. The baker does not care about legends, at least, not at this hour. His concerns are more immediate. The butter is too warm. The dough is slightly stubborn. The oven needs attention. Someone has left flour on the wrong side of the table. Outside, Paris is dark and damp. But inside the bakery, the day's work has already been underway for hours. A lamp burns near the wall. The flame is small. It throws yellow light across wooden shelves, baskets, bowls, and sacks of flour. The baker's sleeves are rolled back. His hands move with the confidence that comes from repeating the same movements thousands of times. Press, turn, roll, fold. The work looks simple when done well. Most skilled work does. You might stand beside the table and assume you could reproduce it after watching for a few minutes. The baker might allow you to believe this. Then he would hand you the dough. Within moments, you would discover that the dough has opinions. It stretches when you want it firm. It resists when you want it soft. The butter escapes. The edges become uneven. Your beautiful crescent resembles a wounded shoe. The baker quietly takes the rolling pin back. This is where the French part of the croissant story becomes clearer. France does not need to invent the idea of curved bread. It does something more important to the pastry we recognize today. It transforms the structure. During the 19th century, Parisian bakers become increasingly familiar with products associated with Vienna. The influence of August Zung's Viennese bakery is particularly important. His establishment helps make Viennese-style bread fashionable among Parisian customers. Other bakers imitate what sells, but imitation is rarely exact. Local ingredients differ, local techniques differ, customers have their own preferences. A copied food begins changing almost immediately. Imagine a Parisian baker visiting a successful Viennese-style shop. He looks through the window. Customers are buying. That is the first thing he notices. Then he studies the goods, the shapes, the crust, the arrangement. Perhaps he buys something. He tears it open. He thinks. He does not ask whether France has moral permission to adapt an Austrian pastry. He asks a much older question. Can I make this better? Or perhaps more realistically, can I sell this too? Competition is an excellent culinary teacher. Soon versions of Viennese breads appear elsewhere. The term viennoiserie becomes associated with this family of baking. Even now, the French language preserves the memory. Viennoiserie, Viennese things, the name is almost a confession. France never entirely hides the ancestry. Yet what happens next is distinctly French. French baking already has a long relationship with enriched doughs, butter, pastry techniques, and careful control of texture. The idea of layering fat and dough is not born solely for the croissant. Laminated pastry has its own complicated history. Puff pastry techniques developed through earlier European cooking traditions, with recipes evolving over generations. By the time French bakers begin transforming crescent-shaped Viennese goods, they possess a technical vocabulary capable of changing the pastry completely. So picture the table again. A rectangle of dough lies before the baker. Butter rests inside. The dough folds over it, then the rolling begins. Pressure spreads the butter into a thin sheet. The baker folds the dough. Now there are layers. He turns it, rolls again, folds again. The number of layers multiplies. But the process cannot be hurried. This is crucial. Butter has moods, too cold and it becomes brittle. It breaks into hard fragments inside the dough. Too warm and it becomes greasy. It smears into the flour. The baker wants something in between. Firm, flexible, cool. The dough and butter must move together. This means temperature becomes part of the recipe. The room matters, the weather matters, the season matters. A bakery in winter behaves differently from a bakery in summer. Before mechanical refrigeration becomes common, controlling temperature requires experience and timing. A baker learns the personality of his workspace. He knows which corner stays cool. He knows when the morning will become too warm. He knows how long dough can rest. Recipes may give instructions. Hands give judgment. This is why two people can follow the same recipe and produce very different bread. The written page cannot tell you exactly what the dough feels like today. The baker's fingers can. Once the folding is complete, the dough rests. Fermentation continues. Yeast works invisibly. This tiny living organism consumes sugars and releases gas. The dough slowly expands. Nothing dramatic happens. No sparks, no sudden transformation. The surface simply becomes a little fuller, a little softer. Then the baker rolls the dough out again. He cuts triangles. Each triangle is stretched and rolled. The broad end curls toward the narrow point. The familiar form appears beneath his hands, a crescent. At this stage, the pastry looks almost modest, pale, soft, unbaked. It does not yet possess the brittle golden shell that makes the finished croissant so attractive. The shaped pieces are left to rise. Again, patience. This is not fast food. The croissant is a conspiracy of waiting. Mix, rest, fold. Rest, shape, rest, bake. The customer sees only the final few minutes. The baker lives through all the hours before them. Eventually the tray enters the oven. Now the hidden architecture becomes visible. Heat melts the butter. Water turns into steam. The steam pushes between the layers. Yeast gases expand. The pastry rises. Its surface begins to color. Pale cream becomes gold. Gold deepens toward brown along the ridges. Butter reaches the hot metal below and hisses. The smell changes. Raw flour disappears. Warm bread fills the room. Then comes toasted butter. If you have ever walked past a bakery at exactly the right moment, you know how unfair this smell can be. You may have no intention of buying anything. You may have eaten already. You may be late. None of this matters. Butter has found you. The baker opens the oven. Heat rolls outward. The croissants are larger now. Their layers have separated. Their surfaces shine. He lifts the tray. There is a faint crackling sound as the crusts cool. This sound is rarely included in grand histories of Europe. It should be. Because while politicians argue, people are waiting outside. The first customers arrive. A worker. A servant. Perhaps someone carrying breakfast back to a wealthier household. Perhaps a clerk on his way somewhere. The exact clientele depends on neighborhood and price. A laminated butter pastry is not necessarily the cheapest possible breakfast. Good butter costs money, skilled labor costs money, fine flour costs money, but urban markets grow, the middle classes expand, consumption changes. A pastry can become part of ordinary aspiration. You do not need to be a queen to eat elegantly. You need a few coins and a bakery nearby. This democratization of small luxuries is one of the quieter changes of the 19th century. Things once associated mainly with elite tables can become available in altered forms to broader urban populations. Sugar becomes more common, coffee becomes more accessible, chocolate spreads, pastries multiply. Industrial production and global trade alter the availability of ingredients. The café and bakery become places where a person can purchase a small experience of refinement. A croissant is ideal for this world. It is luxurious enough to feel special, small enough to buy individually, portable enough to carry, elegant enough to serve in a café, and foreign enough in ancestry to have once seemed fashionable. Over time, however, the foreignness fades. Customers stop thinking primarily about Vienna. The pastry becomes part of Paris. This is the point at which cultural adoption becomes cultural ownership, not legal ownership, emotional ownership. A child grows up seeing croissants in neighborhood bakeries. To that child, the pastry is not an Austrian import. It is simply breakfast. Her parents may remember when a certain style became fashionable. Her grandparents may remember something different. She does not. Tradition often begins when memory of novelty disappears. The croissant becomes increasingly French because French people stop needing an explanation for why it is there. It belongs. And Paris is particularly good at turning local habits into international symbols. The city is already becoming one of the world's great centers of fashion, dining, art, and tourism. Foreign visitors arrive with expectations. They want to experience Paris. But what does that mean? A city is too large to consume whole. So travelers collect symbols: a boulevard, a cathedral, a cafe, a loaf of bread, a glass of wine, a pastry. The croissant fits perfectly. Its shape is recognizable. Its name is French. Its texture feels luxurious. Its natural companion is coffee. Soon it begins doing something the old kipferl never needed to do. It represents France to people who are not French. This changes the story again. Once a food becomes internationally associated with a country, people begin assuming that country invented it completely. Pizza becomes Italy. Tea becomes England in certain imaginations, despite the plant and drink having much older Asian histories. Chocolate becomes associated with European confectionery, even though cacao comes from the Americas. Coffee becomes Italian through espresso culture for many modern drinkers, despite its African and Arabian roots. And the croissant becomes France. Cultural identity compresses long journeys into simple labels. This is understandable. You cannot recite the complete history of global exchange every time you order breakfast. The waiter would become impatient. Still, it is worth knowing that the label hides movement. Look at the croissant on the table. The wheat may come from one region, the butter from another. The technique has multiple ancestors. The shape remembers Central Europe. The name is French. The coffee beside it has crossed an even greater historical distance. The sugar may carry the legacy of colonial agriculture. The porcelain cup has its own story. Even the cafe chair has a history if you are patient enough. Nothing is simple once you look closely. This is either wonderful or exhausting. Tonight we will call it wonderful. Outside our imaginary bakery, Paris is waking. The sky lightens above the rooftops. Street lamps become less necessary. A delivery cart stops nearby. Someone lifts a wooden crate. A woman opens shutters on an upper floor. A newspaper seller prepares for the morning. The baker has no time to admire the scene. Another batch needs shaping. He reaches for the dough. His movements repeat. Roll, cut, curl, arrange. The crescent appears again and again. Perhaps he has no idea that people in distant countries will one day imitate this pastry. Perhaps he would find the idea ridiculous. Why would someone in New York, Tokyo, Sydney, or a city far beyond anything he knows care about this particular breakfast? Because foods travel, we have already learned that. The croissant does not stop moving when it becomes French. France becomes its new departure point. From Paris, the pastry spreads outward. Hotels serve it, restaurants copy it, cookbooks describe it, travelers remember it, bakers abroad learn the technique. Eventually, industrial producers find ways to freeze dough, manufacture pastries at scale, and transport the croissant far beyond the neighborhood bakery. The small crescent goes global, but something is lost when production becomes easier. A handmade croissant depends upon time. Industrial production tries to conquer time. Machines roll dough. Factories control temperature. Frozen pastries travel great distances. A hotel can offer croissants without employing a baker who begins work deep in the night. Convenient, consistent, and sometimes rather sad. Anyone who has eaten an excellent fresh croissant and then eaten a soft packaged one knows that they share a name more confidently than they share a soul. The best version still reveals the old craft. You can see the layers. You can hear the crust. You can smell the butter before taking a bite. The inside is airy, but not empty. The exterior is crisp, without being dry. It is a small reminder that repetition and patience can create something machines struggle to imitate perfectly. And perhaps this is where France earns its place in the story. Not through absolute invention, through refinement. The French baker takes a traveling crescent and teaches it a new language. Butter, layers, fermentation, precision. The result becomes so persuasive that the world forgets the accent it had before. By the later 19th century and into the early 20th, the croissant moves steadily toward its modern identity. Recipes change. Methods become more standardized. The laminated form grows dominant. Parisian bakery culture gives the pastry a home. The Austrian ancestor remains inside the family tree, but the French descendant has become its own creature. This is not theft, it is transformation. Cultures have always done this. The Romans borrow, the Arabs borrow, the French borrow, the English borrow, the Ottomans borrow. Every kitchen is full of ancestors from somewhere else. The idea of a perfectly pure national cuisine is largely a fantasy created after centuries of exchange have already happened. Potatoes are not originally Irish. Tomatoes are not originally Italian. Chili peppers are not originally Asian. Coffee is not originally European. Chocolate is not originally Swiss. And the crescent that becomes the croissant is not originally Parisian. Yet all these foods become genuinely meaningful in their adopted homes. Origin is not the same as identity. A person can be born in one place and become deeply connected to another. Food can do the same. The croissant begins with ancestors elsewhere. France raises it. Paris gives it a reputation. French bakers give it the form most of the world now recognizes. So perhaps asking whether the croissant is really French gives us the wrong kind of answer. It is French, it is Austrian, it is European, it is a product of migration, imitation, technique, commerce, and appetite. Most importantly, at this moment, it is getting cold. The baker slides a fresh tray onto the counter. Morning is fully here. Coffee is being poured in cafes nearby. Paris begins another ordinary day, but our journey is not finished. We have watched the crescent cross borders. Now, we must watch it become a symbol. Let us leave the warm bakery behind and step into the café, where the humble descendant of an Austrian roll is about to acquire something more powerful than butter, an identity. The café is only a few streets away. But first, remain outside the bakery for a moment. Morning has arrived properly now. The blue-grey darkness over Paris has thinned into pale light. Chimneys release smoke above the rooftops. Shopkeepers lift shutters. Horses pull carts over wet stones. A woman carries a basket beneath one arm while trying to keep the hem of her dress away from the mud. The bakery window glows behind you. Inside are rows of bread and pastry. Outside is a city learning to consume them in new ways. During the 19th century, Paris changes dramatically. Population grows, commerce expands. Railways connect the capital more closely with the rest of France. Goods can move more efficiently. People can move more efficiently. And when people move, tastes move with them. A person from Normandy brings memories of butter and cream. Someone from another region brings a preference for a particular bread. Workers arrive from villages. Merchants arrive from abroad. Tourists appear in greater numbers. Paris absorbs them all. Then during the middle decades of the century, the physical city itself is transformed. Old neighborhoods are cut through. Broad boulevards appear. Buildings rise in more uniform rows. Parks, sewers, streets, and public spaces are redesigned. The Paris that will become familiar through paintings and photographs begins taking shape. This new urban environment helps café culture flourish. Wide sidewalks offer space for tables. Large windows allow customers to look outward while allowing passers-by to look in. The café becomes part refreshment room, part theatre. You do not simply go there because you are thirsty. You go there to occupy Paris. Imagine sitting outside one on a mild morning. Your chair faces the street. This is important. You are not facing the person beside you. You are facing humanity. A clerk passes, then a soldier. Then a woman carrying flowers. A carriage rolls by. Two men argue beside a newspaper stand. A dog pauses under your table with the confidence of an animal that has successfully begged from strangers before. The waiter arrives. Coffee. Perhaps bread, perhaps butter, perhaps a croissant. Now the pastry has found its stage. The café table does something the bakery counter cannot. It turns eating into an image. The croissant rests on a small plate. The coffee cup sits beside it. Perhaps there is a newspaper. Perhaps a cigarette later in the century. Perhaps sunlight catches the rim of the cup. Anyone walking past can see the arrangement. Anyone painting urban life can include it. Anyone visiting Paris can remember it. The meal becomes part of the city's visual language. This is how a food becomes more than food. It becomes scenery, and Paris is exceptionally good at scenery. By the later 19th century, artists are fascinated with modern city life. They paint cafes, dance halls, theatres, streets, parks, railway stations, restaurants, and ordinary moments of leisure. The subject is no longer only kings, saints, battles, and mythological heroes. A person sitting at a table can be worth painting. Breakfast can belong to modern life. The cafe becomes a place where class, fashion, work, idleness, loneliness, and pleasure all sit close together. Some customers are wealthy, some are not. Some come to meet friends, some come because their rooms are cold and the cafe has heat. Some read, some watch, some want to be watched, some simply need coffee. The croissant fits all of them. It requires no ceremony. You can tear it with your fingers. Dip a piece into coffee if nobody you respect is looking, or even if they are. Flakes scatter across the plate. Butter leaves a slight shine on the fingertips. The pastry is refined but forgiving, and because it is small, it can become habitual. This matters enormously. Foods become culturally powerful through repetition. A grand banquet may be remembered once, breakfast returns tomorrow and the next day. And the next. Imagine a Parisian clerk developing a routine. He leaves home in the morning, walks the same streets, stops at the same cafe, orders the same coffee. Sometimes he buys a croissant. The waiter eventually recognizes him. No one considers this historically important. It is merely Tuesday. But thousands of Tuesdays create culture. The croissant becomes French, not because someone signs a document declaring it French. It becomes French because people in France repeatedly eat it until its presence feels natural. The same thing happens in homes and bakeries. Children see it. They learn the word. They associate the smell with mornings. A food becomes attached to memory. And memory is stronger than provenance. Tell someone that a beloved childhood food originated elsewhere, and you may receive a surprisingly defensive response. But origin does not erase belonging. The croissant can descend from Austrian kipferl and still become genuinely French. This is not a contradiction. It is how culture works. Consider the tomato. For centuries, no Italian cook could have used it because the plant originated in the Americas and did not reach Europe until after transatlantic contact. Yet try imagining Italian cuisine without tomatoes now, or consider the potato. It comes from the Andes, yet it becomes deeply associated with Ireland, Northern Europe, and countless regional dishes far from its original homeland. Chili peppers travel from the Americas and become so central to cuisines across Asia that many dishes now seem unimaginable without them. Tea originates in Asia but becomes embedded in British social ritual. Chocolate begins with cacao traditions in the Americas and becomes transformed through European sugar, milk, industrial production, and confectionery. Food is migration you can taste. The croissant belongs to the same story. Yet there is something particularly elegant about its transformation because the evidence remains visible. The crescent shape is a fossil. Even after the dough changes, the silhouette remembers. A circle would have forgotten Vienna more easily. The crescent refuses. This is perhaps why the Ottoman siege legend remains attractive. People see the shape and want it to mean something. Why a crescent? Surely there must be a dramatic reason. A defeated army, a triumphant baker, a symbolic breakfast. The story satisfies the shape. Reality offers something less theatrical. Crescent-shaped baked goods existed in Central European traditions before the famous siege. The form was already familiar, but a shape without a dramatic origin feels incomplete to the human mind. So we add one. This happens throughout history. Old buildings acquire ghost stories. Ancient stones acquire legends about giants. Unusual place names acquire tales about kings who probably never visited. Foods acquire famous inventors. The unknown makes us uncomfortable. A legend fills the gap. And once repeated often enough, the legend becomes part of the food's cultural history, even if it is not part of its literal origin. That distinction is useful. The story about Viennese bakers defeating Ottoman tunneling may not reliably explain how the kipferl began, but it does tell us how later Europeans wanted to remember the siege. The Marie Antoinette story may not explain how the croissant entered France, but it tells us how people use famous individuals to simplify cultural exchange. Myths are evidence too, just not always evidence of the event they claim to describe. Sometimes they are evidence of memory, and memory can be wonderfully strange. By the early 20th century, the croissant is increasingly recognizable in the form we know. Laminated dough becomes central to its identity. Butter-rich versions become celebrated. French baking literature records recipes and methods. The pastry is no longer merely a foreign curiosity. It is at home. Yet even now there is variation. Not every croissant is made with pure butter. Some use other fats. Shapes can signal ingredients in certain baking traditions. Straight or gently curved versions coexist. Recipes vary between bakeries. Fermentation times differ. Flour differs. Butter differs. The perfect croissant is not one universal object. It is a family of closely related decisions. A baker can make the crust darker, the interior more open, the butter flavor stronger, the tips sharper, the shape more curved. Customers develop preferences. One bakery becomes famous in a neighborhood. People cross several streets for its pastries, even though another bakery is closer. This may be the highest form of culinary loyalty, walking farther before breakfast. And the work remains difficult. The romantic image of the Parisian baker often hides exhaustion. The working day begins when most people are asleep. Heat is constant. Flour dust fills the air. Heavy sacks must be moved. Production must be timed. Customers expect freshness. A failed batch cannot be explained philosophically to a hungry person at 7 in the morning. The croissant must work, again and again and again. Skill is repetition under pressure. Suppose you enter the bakery before opening. The shaped croissants are proofing. They look swollen and delicate. Touch them carelessly, and you can damage the layers. The baker checks them without needing a clock to explain everything. He knows by sight, perhaps by touch. The oven is ready. Trays go in. The room warms further. Then comes the smell. Butter and toasted wheat. It reaches the street. A passerby turns his head. The first sale has almost happened before the door opens. This is why bakery smells feel almost unfair. They bypass reason. You can tell yourself you do not need a croissant. Your body has already entered negotiations. Soon, the tray is on the counter. The first pastry is lifted. Its crust is fragile. A few flakes break away. The customer carries it toward the café. And there, beside coffee, the croissant becomes part of another ritual. But Paris is no longer keeping its rituals to itself. Railways bring visitors. Steamships bring visitors. Guidebooks tell them what to see. International exhibitions display French culture, industry, fashion, architecture, and food to enormous audiences. Paris becomes one of the great destinations of the modern tourist imagination. Visitors return home with memories. Some bring objects, others bring habits. A traveler from Britain may remember French bread. An American visitor may remember cafes. A hotelier may decide guests expect French-style breakfast pastries. A baker abroad may study French technique. The croissant begins another migration. This time it travels under a French name. That is the crucial difference. The kipferl travels west as something Viennese. The croissant travels outward as something French. France has become the new cultural origin point. A food can have more than one beginning. There is the beginning of the shape, the beginning of the technique, the beginning of the name, the beginning of commercial popularity, the beginning of international fame. Choose a different beginning and you choose a different country. This is why arguments about who really invented a food can become endless. People are often answering different questions without realizing it. Who first made crescent-shaped bread? Who first called a pastry a croissant? Who first laminated the dough? Who made it popular? Who made the version we eat today? These are not the same question, and they do not necessarily have the same answer. The old Vienna legend gives us one beginning. The Austrian kipferl gives us another. Auguste Zang's Paris bakery gives us another. French laminated baking gives us another. Parisian café culture gives us another. International tourism gives us yet another. Instead of a birth certificate, the croissant has a family album. Some pages are missing. Some photographs have the wrong names written beneath them. Marie Antoinette appears in an album where she probably does not belong. A heroic Viennese baker poses in a scene created generations later, but the family resemblance remains: crescent, dough, butter, morning, coffee. These elements slowly gather until the modern image feels inevitable. It was never inevitable. That may be the most important fact. History looks orderly from the future because we know what survives. Imagine 19th century Paris filled with hundreds of foods, fashions, shops, products, and habits. Most do not become global symbols. Some disappear completely. Others survive only in one region. The croissant happens to escape. Why? Taste helps. Its visual shape helps. French culinary prestige helps. Parisian tourism helps. The growth of hotels and cafes helps. Modern refrigeration eventually helps. Industrial freezing helps. International baking schools help. Air travel later helps. Advertising helps. Every generation adds another road. By the 20th century, the croissant can travel without a Viennese baker or a Parisian baker physically moving anywhere. The recipe travels, the technique travels. Frozen dough travels. Machines travel, the idea travels. A bakery thousands of miles from France can open in the morning and fill its windows with crescents. Some are excellent, some are heavy, some are soft. Some contain chocolate, almond cream, cheese, ham, or ingredients that would make a 19th century Parisian pause thoughtfully before taking another bite. The croissant continues changing because living foods always change. Purists complain. They have always complained. Tradition survives partly because someone is constantly insisting that everybody else is doing it wrong. But the classic version remains remarkably simple: flour, water, yeast, salt, sugar in some recipes, milk in some, and most importantly, butter. No gold leaf. No royal ingredient, no secret spice brought from a distant island. The luxury lies in labor and technique. That is a very French conclusion to an Austrian beginning. Take ordinary ingredients, apply unreasonable patience, charge someone for breakfast. The cafe door opens ahead of us. Inside, cups touch saucers. Conversation rises softly. A waiter crosses the room. Near the window, a fresh croissant rests on a white plate. It looks completely at home. No label explains Vienna. No portrait of Marie Antoinette hangs beside it. No Ottoman army appears in the distance. The pastry no longer needs its origin story to exist. That is how you know the transformation is complete. It has become ordinary. And ordinary things are often the deepest parts of culture. So finish the last warm piece from the baker's tray. Brush the crumbs from your coat. The working night is ending. The public mourning has begun. We have followed the croissant from old Central European crescents through Viennese baking and into the skilled hands of French bakers. Now only one question remains. How does a borrowed pastry become so completely French that the Eiffel Tower almost seems to require one sitting nearby? We drift onward, from the hot bakery into the cool morning café. There the croissant will acquire its final ingredient. Not butter, not flour, not yeast. Myth. We drift onward, from the hot bakery into the cool morning café where the croissant acquires its final ingredient. Myth. Not the old myth about heroic bakers beneath the walls of Vienna. Not the myth about Marie Antoinette carrying a beloved pastry from Austria to Versailles, something larger. The myth of Paris itself. Sit down near the window. The chair is small, the table is smaller. Parisian cafés have long possessed the remarkable ability to place two cups, a newspaper, a plate, a sugar bowl, and several human elbows on a surface, apparently designed for one saucer. Your knees may be negotiating with the table leg. Ignore them. The coffee has arrived. Beside it sits a croissant, golden warm, quietly shedding flakes onto the plate before you have even touched it. Outside, Paris moves through the morning. Perhaps we are now in the early 20th century. Motorcars have begun appearing beside horse-drawn vehicles. New fashions move along the boulevards. Electric light is changing the night. The metro carries passengers beneath the streets. Newspapers are everywhere. Photography has changed the way people see themselves and their cities. Cinema is beginning to create another kind of dream. Paris is modern, or at least it is trying very hard to look modern. Yet the café remains. People still sit, they still watch, they still gossip, they still read. They still delay whatever they are supposed to be doing. And the croissant fits perfectly into this performance of ordinary life. By now, the pastry has become familiar enough that its Viennese ancestry matters less to the average customer. The word is French, the baker is French, the café is French, the street outside is French. The person eating it may have consumed the same breakfast every week for years. At what point does borrowed culture become local culture? There is no official answer. Perhaps it happens when people stop explaining it. Nobody enters the café and says, "I would like one of those pastries descended from Austrian kipferl and transformed through French laminated baking techniques." They say croissant, that is enough. The foreign ancestor has disappeared inside the word. And then something interesting happens. Foreign visitors begin carrying the French identity of the croissant outward. Imagine a traveler arriving in Paris from London. He has crossed the channel. Perhaps he has come by train and ferry. He wants to see the city he has read about. Paris already exists in his imagination before he reaches it. This is important. Tourists do not visit places with empty minds. They arrive carrying pictures, they expect romance, fashion, art, wine, bread, cafes, perhaps a certain amount of sophisticated rudeness from waiters. The city then performs against those expectations. A traveler sits at a cafe, orders coffee, sees a croissant. The image is perfect. Paris has confirmed itself. He returns home. When he describes the trip, breakfast becomes part of the memory. The croissant is no longer simply something he ate, it is something he ate in Paris. That difference is enormous. Food attached to travel becomes emotional evidence. A smell can restore a city years later. Butter and coffee can bring back a street. A certain bread can recall a hotel room. A railway platform, a person you traveled with, rain on a window, or the morning you first saw a famous building. Tourism gives foods portable meaning. And Paris has meaning to spare. By the 20th century, French cuisine enjoys extraordinary international prestige. French culinary terminology influences professional kitchens far beyond France. French chefs become associated with technical discipline. French restaurants become models of refinement. French wine carries status. French sauces carry status. Even French words carry status. A menu can make something sound more expensive simply by refusing to translate it. The croissant benefits from this prestige. Its French identity becomes a selling point abroad. A bakery in another country can offer a French-style breakfast. A hotel can place croissants in a basket and suggest continental elegance. A café can use French names to create atmosphere. The pastry becomes part of a package. France is no longer merely a country. It is a brand of pleasure. Wine in the evening, coffee in the morning. Cheese, bread, butter, a table on the pavement. Time moving slightly slower than it should. Of course, actual French life is more complicated. A factory worker rushing to work is not participating in an endless romantic film. A mother trying to get children out the door in the morning may not pause to admire the philosophical significance of laminated dough. Many French people do not eat croissants every morning. Some barely eat them at all. Daily breakfast may be much simpler. Bread, coffee, something quick. The international image exaggerates, but exaggeration is exactly how symbols work. The cowboy does not represent every American. The red telephone box does not represent every British street. The gondola does not represent the daily commute of every Italian. And the croissant does not represent every French breakfast. It does not need to. Symbols survive by being recognizable, not statistically representative. The crescent is wonderfully recognizable. Draw a rough, curved pastry on a sign, and people understand. Place it beside a steaming cup, and the message becomes morning. Place the same image beneath the word Paris, and suddenly it becomes travel. That is extraordinary work for a piece of dough. The croissant also benefits from photography. Before mass visual culture, a food's reputation travels mainly through description, recipe, memory, and physical imitation. Photography changes this. Later, color printing changes it further. Advertising changes it again. Postcards, magazines, travel posters, cookbooks, hotel brochures, films, and eventually television repeat certain images of France. Café tables, baguettes, wine bottles, cheese, croissants, repetition turns association into certainty. See the image enough times and it feels ancient. You begin to imagine that French people must have been eating laminated butter croissants beside coffee since the Middle Ages. Perhaps a knight stopped for one before riding toward battle. Perhaps a monk carried one through Canterbury. Perhaps William the Conqueror packed several before sailing from Normandy. He did not. The chronology refuses to cooperate. A medieval person would not recognize the modern croissant as part of ordinary French food culture. The pastry belongs to a much later world. This is one of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining history. We project familiar national symbols backward. Italy receives tomatoes too early. Ireland receives potatoes too early. England receives tea too early. France receives croissants too early. Scotland receives modern tartans too neatly. The past begins looking like a costume shop organized by country. Real history is messier. If you traveled through medieval France, regional differences would be far more important than many modern national food stereotypes. What people eat depends on landscape, harvest, wealth, season, religious rules, and local trade. A fisherman on the coast eats differently from a shepherd inland. A wealthy household in Paris eats differently from a peasant family in Normandy. Someone in a village near Flanders may encounter different influences from someone near the Mediterranean. There is no universal French breakfast waiting across the kingdom, and there is certainly no laminated croissant. Yet by the 20th century, the croissant has become so thoroughly attached to France that this absence feels surprising. That tells us how successful the transformation has been. The adopted child now appears in the family portrait as if it has always been there. World events then carry French food culture farther. Wars move soldiers, migration moves families, political upheaval moves refugees, economic opportunity moves workers. Every movement carries taste. A French baker settling abroad can establish a bakery. A foreign baker training in France can return home with techniques. Hotels imitate Parisian service. Cookbooks translate recipes. Professional culinary schools teach laminated dough. The croissant spreads. But spreading creates another transformation. The farther a food travels, the more variations appear. Some bakers use margarine instead of butter because it is cheaper or easier to handle. industrial producers develop fats designed specifically for lamination. Machines roll enormous sheets of dough with a precision impossible for a tired human arm. Freezing technology allows shaped croissants to be produced in one place and baked somewhere else. A customer can enter a café thousands of miles from France and smell a croissant baking, even though nobody in the building mixed the dough. This is both impressive and slightly eerie. The oven is local. The labor may not be. Globalization allows the final moments of freshness to occur near the customer while much of the actual production remains invisible. The old Parisian baker would recognize part of the process. He would also be baffled by the scale. Imagine showing him a modern industrial bakery, steel machinery, conveyor systems, temperature control, freezers, packaging, thousands of identical crescents moving in rows. He might stare silently, then he might inspect the butter. Bakers have priorities. Industrial production changes the texture and reputation of the croissant. For some customers, the word comes to mean a soft crescent-shaped bread sold in plastic packaging. For others, it means a crisp artisanal pastry requiring days of careful fermentation and folding. Both are called croissants. The distance between them can be enormous. This creates a modern return to craftsmanship. As industrial food becomes common, handmade food gains new prestige. A bakery that makes croissants from scratch can advertise the labor itself. Long fermentation, high-quality butter, careful lamination, hand shaping, small batches. The inconvenience becomes valuable. What industry tries to remove, luxury sometimes restores. Time. This is a fascinating cycle. Originally, careful labor is simply necessary because there is no alternative. Then machines reduce labor, then handmade production becomes special, precisely because machines exist. The old method turns into a premium experience. A baker folding dough by hand can now represent authenticity. His 19th century predecessor might find this amusing. To him, folding dough is not authenticity, it is Tuesday. But modern customers want a connection to craft. They want to believe the pastry has been touched by human judgment. And when the croissant is excellent, you can understand why. Take the one on the plate before you. Pick it up carefully. The outside gives a faint crackle beneath your fingers. A few flakes fall. You pull the pastry apart. The interior stretches slightly before separating. Inside is a network of delicate layers, not dense bread, not cake. Something between structure and emptiness. Steam escapes if it is fresh enough. The smell of butter rises. This is the French contribution made visible. The Austrian ancestor gives us the crescent. The French transformation gives us the layers. Neither fact cancels the other. But national myths often dislike shared credit. People enjoy claiming foods. Arguments begin. Who invented it? Who owns it? Who made it first? Which country has the authentic version? The questions can become surprisingly emotional. Perhaps because food is intimate. You eat it with family. You eat it as a child. It appears at celebrations. It belongs to home. So when someone says your national food is actually foreign, it can sound like they are questioning part of your identity. But almost every cuisine is foreign if you go back far enough. Agriculture itself spreads. Plants migrate. Animals migrate. Techniques migrate. Religions change diets. Empires rearrange ingredients. Trade introduces flavors. Conquest introduces habits. Poverty creates recipes. Wealth modifies them. Nothing stays still. If your ancestors lived in England before potatoes arrived from the Americas, their cooking looked different. If they lived in Italy before tomatoes, their sauces looked different. If they lived in Hungary before New World peppers, their famous paprika traditions could not yet exist in the form we know. If they lived in France before coffee arrived, the café morning we are imagining would be impossible. National cuisine is not a sealed inheritance. It is a scrapbook. Pages are added, things are crossed out, foreign recipes are copied. Old ingredients disappear, new ones become essential. Eventually, nobody remembers which page came first. The croissant may be one of the most elegant examples because the history is hidden beneath such a simple image. France, breakfast, done. But now you know to look farther east. Vienna, kipferl, the Ottoman legends, coffee houses, August Zang, Parisian bakers, laminated dough, cafes, tourism, industrial production, the single crescent opens into a map, and still we have not reached the end. Because once the croissant becomes a symbol of France, French people begin interacting with the symbol themselves. Tourists expect croissants, hotels provide them, cafes display them, bakeries perfect them. Expectation reinforces tradition. The image created partly by outsiders becomes something locals can perform, reject, enjoy, or reinterpret. Culture becomes a mirror facing another mirror. The croissant is French because the world thinks it is French. The world thinks it is French because France made it French. France continues making it French partly because the world expects it. Round and round the crescent goes. And perhaps this is the quiet answer to our original question. Why were croissants never really French? Because really French is too simple a category. The pastry has Austrian ancestry. Its famous origin legends involve Ottoman Vienna. Its journey into Paris is connected with Viennese bakers and entrepreneurs. Its transformation depends on French pastry technique. Its identity depends on Parisian culture. Its global fame depends on travelers, hotels, media, migration, and commerce. Take away any one of these chapters, and the modern croissant becomes harder to explain. It belongs to France, but it also belongs to movement. That is not a weakness in its identity, it is the reason it has one. Outside the cafe window, Paris continues waking. A bicycle passes, someone opens a newspaper. A waiter wipes another table. The morning sun touches the upper floors across the street. Your coffee is almost gone. Only a few flakes remain on the plate. They look insignificant, but crumbs are what historians often have. A word in a cookbook, an advertisement, a bakery address, a traveler's description, a household account, a shape preserved across generations. From those crumbs we reconstruct journeys, and sometimes the journey is far larger than the food. We began with a pastry. We have ended with migration, but there is still one last road to follow. The croissant has become French in the eyes of the world. Now we must watch what happens when the world begins making the croissant its own. Let us leave the cafe table behind and step once more into the street. The crescent is traveling again. Let us leave the cafe table behind and step once more into the street. The crescent is traveling again. This time, there are no royal carriages carrying teenage archduchesses across borders, no Ottoman army outside Vienna, no 19th century entrepreneur opening a fashionable bakery in Paris. The new roads are faster, steamships cross oceans, railways cross countries, migrants carry recipes in notebooks and memories, hotels imitate one another, professional cooks travel for work, cookbooks are translated. Tourists return home wanting to taste their journeys again, and everywhere the croissant goes, someone changes it. This should no longer surprise us. It has been changing from the beginning. Imagine a French baker leaving Normandy for another country. Perhaps he carries little more than clothing, a few tools, and knowledge learned through years of work. He does not need to pack croissants into a trunk. That would be a terrible way to transport them. He carries something more durable technique. His hands know when dough is ready. His eyes know when butter is too warm. He knows how tightly to shape the crescent. He understands the oven. These things weigh nothing. Customs officials cannot confiscate them. Knowledge crosses the border inside the person. This is how much of culinary history moves, not through formal declarations, through hands. The baker arrives in a new city. Perhaps the flour behaves differently. Perhaps local butter contains a different amount of water. Perhaps customers prefer sweeter pastries. Perhaps the climate is warmer than Paris and the dough becomes difficult to laminate. He adapts. Soon the croissant changes again. The same process happens when non-French bakers study French pastry. They travel to Paris. They train. They observe. They return to London, New York, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, Melbourne, Montreal, or cities much farther from the old Viennese roads where our story began. They open bakeries. Customers arrive. The French croissant becomes local. Then local bakers begin experimenting. Chocolate enters, almond filling enters, cheese, ham, fruit, cream, nuts, spices. Some variations remain close to French tradition. Others wander cheerfully away from it. Eventually, bakers begin combining the croissant with other pastries. Purists sigh. Customers form queues. History continues. This is another useful lesson. The people living inside a tradition rarely agree about where its boundaries should be. One baker says a croissant must contain excellent butter. Another uses margarine. One insists the shape should curve strongly. Another prefers it nearly straight. One allows fillings. Another considers filling the classic croissant an offense against civilization. Both wake tomorrow and continue baking. Tradition is not a museum cabinet. It is an argument that survives. And France itself contains variation. Walk into different bakeries, and you will find differences in size, color, texture, richness, and shape. Some croissants are pale and soft, others are deeply browned and crisp. Some have tight interiors. Others reveal dramatic open chambers when torn apart. Some are intensely buttery, others are more restrained. The word croissant creates an expectation. It does not enforce perfect uniformity. That expectation, however, is now global. A traveler can wake in a hotel thousands of miles from Paris and find a basket of crescents at breakfast. Perhaps they are fresh, perhaps they were frozen, perhaps they were baked somewhere nearby. Perhaps they have the texture of a small pillow and only a distant philosophical relationship with butter. Still, the shape communicates something. Continental breakfast, European, French, elegant enough. The croissant has become visual shorthand. And once a food becomes shorthand, its history becomes even easier to forget. A symbol does not need footnotes. Imagine an advertisement, a tiny cafe table, a cup of coffee, a croissant. Perhaps the Eiffel Tower appears faintly in the distance. You understand immediately. Paris. Nobody adds Vienna to the background. Nobody includes the Ethiopian highlands to explain the deeper origin of the coffee plant. Nobody draws Yemeni ports, Ottoman coffee houses, sugar plantations, wheat fields, dairy farms, flour mills, or exhausted bakers working before dawn. The advertisement compresses centuries into one pleasant morning. That is what symbols do. They erase the supply chain. They erase the argument, they erase the journey, they leave the feeling, and the feeling is powerful. Warm pastry, dark coffee, a quiet table, a city waking beyond the window. Perhaps that is why the croissant's complicated origin has never damaged its Frenchness. Most people are not eating historical accuracy, they are eating memory and expectation. If you visit Paris and buy a croissant from a good neighborhood bakery, the fact that its distant ancestor is Austrian does not make the experience less French. Quite the opposite. You are participating in the final stage of a long transformation. France did what cultures have always done. It took something that arrived from elsewhere and made it local. Then it made it excellent. Then it made it famous. There is no contradiction here. The mistake comes only when we assume that cultural belonging requires pure origin. Purity is rarely how history works. Think of a medieval market in York. A merchant's goods may have traveled astonishing distances. Think of a harbour in London. Ships bring objects, ingredients, people, and ideas from abroad. Think of Flanders, where trade connects textile towns with distant sources of wool and dye. Think of Cornwall, whose tin enters networks extending far beyond the peninsula. Think of Edinburgh, Canterbury, Normandy, or any place that appears fixed on a map. None is truly isolated. Roads connect them, rivers connect them, marriages connect them. Wars connect them, markets connect them. Human beings are extremely poor at leaving things where they found them. We pick things up, we carry them home, we modify them. Food is perhaps the gentlest evidence of this habit. An empire can leave ruins. A migration can leave recipes. A trade route can leave spices. A war can leave legends. A marriage can leave myths. And sometimes all of them end up on the same breakfast table. Look again at our imaginary croissant. The crescent recalls Central Europe. The old siege story recalls conflict between the Habsburg and Ottoman worlds. The coffee beside it recalls Ethiopia, Yemen, Ottoman cities, Mediterranean merchants, and European cafe culture. The sugar recalls global trade and the terrible histories of plantation slavery. The porcelain recalls technological exchange and European fascination with Asian ceramics. The wheat recalls generations of agricultural labor. The butter recalls pasture, cattle, dairy work, transport, and refrigeration. The newspaper on the table recalls printing, literacy, politics, and public debate. Even breakfast has ancestors, and perhaps somewhere in your own family line, someone encountered one of these things for the first time. An ancestor tastes coffee and dislikes it. Another sees a tomato and considers it suspicious. Another tries a potato. Another enters a city bakery and encounters a pastry unlike anything available in the village where he grew up. We rarely know these moments. They are too ordinary to record. No one writes in the family Bible, "Today grandfather tried coffee and made a face." Yet these tiny encounters accumulate. A foreign food becomes familiar, then expected, then traditional. Eventually, a descendant insists the family has always eaten it. That is culture happening in real time. Slow enough to be invisible, fast enough to transform the world. The croissant follows exactly this path. First, the distant ancestors. Then the Austrian kipferl, then Viennese influence in Paris, then French adaptation, then lamination, then café culture, then national symbolism, then global export, then endless reinvention. At no stage does someone ring a bell and announce that the identity has changed. There is no official morning when the croissant wakes up Austrian and goes to bed French. Identity accumulates. One bakery at a time. One customer at a time. One breakfast at a time. This is why searching for the single inventor leads us into trouble. There probably is no single person deserving the title. August Zhang matters. Viennese bakers matter. French pastry cooks matter. Anonymous bakers matter. Customers matter. The development of laminated dough matters. Urban Paris matters. Tourism matters. Technology matters. The croissant is less an invention than a collaboration between generations who never meet. One person changes the shape. Another changes the dough. Another changes the method. Another sells it successfully. Another carries it abroad. Another writes down a recipe. Another freezes it. Another improves it again. The finished pastry contains all these invisible conversations. Perhaps that sounds overly poetic for breakfast, but we are awake late talking about pastry history. We surrendered practical judgment some time ago, so let us return to Paris one final time. It is early. Not the Paris of Marie Antoinette, not the Paris of Auguste Zhang, not even necessarily the Paris of the early 20th century, simply Paris. A morning like thousands of others, the bakery lights are already on. A worker unlocks the door. Inside, trays are arranged, baguettes stand upright in baskets, pastries sit behind glass. The baker has been awake for hours. Perhaps the croissants were prepared partly the previous day, the dough has rested. The butter has remained cold. Fermentation has been watched carefully. Now the final batches are baked. A customer enters. Maybe she is on her way to work. She asks for a croissant. There is no ceremony. The baker places it in a small paper bag. Coins change hands. The customer leaves. That is all. No one discusses Vienna. No one mentions Ottoman armies. No one invokes Marie Antoinette. No one debates whether the pastry is genuinely French. The croissant is simply there. And that ordinary moment is stronger evidence of cultural belonging than any legend. France has not merely claimed the croissant. France has lived with it long enough that the claim no longer needs to be spoken. Outside, the customer tears off one end while walking. Flakes fall onto her coat. Some things cannot be refined away. She brushes them off. Perhaps she has coffee waiting at work. Perhaps she eats the entire pastry before reaching the corner. The grand historical journey ends in a very small act. A hungry person eats breakfast. This is where most food history ends. Not in a palace, in a mouth. And perhaps the old Viennese baker from our first story would understand this better than anyone. Imagine bringing him forward through time. You place him outside a Paris bakery. Cars pass. Electric lights shine. People carry strange objects. The noise alone would probably make him reconsider every decision that led to this moment. But then you hand him a croissant. He recognizes the crescent, maybe. He turns it over. The pastry feels unusually light. He smells butter, then he breaks it open. The interior reveals its layers. This he does not recognize. The old shape has survived. Everything inside has changed. He takes a bite. Perhaps he approves. Perhaps he complains that it is too delicate. Bakers are allowed to be difficult. Then you tell him that people across the world think of this as one of the great symbols of France. He might laugh. Or perhaps he would not find it strange at all. A baker understands transformation. Flour becomes dough. Dough becomes bread. Nothing enters the oven and leaves unchanged. Why should culture be different? The croissant enters France as an idea with Austrian ancestry. It leaves France as a global icon. Heat has changed it, time has changed it, hands have changed it. The process is irreversible. You cannot peel away the French layers and discover a pure Austrian pastry hiding beneath. Nor can you erase the Austrian ancestry and pretend Paris created the crescent from nothing. Both histories are baked together. That may be the best answer we can give. Croissants were never really French, if by French we mean born entirely within France, untouched by foreign influence. But if by French we mean transformed in France, embedded in French daily life, perfected through French baking traditions and carried into global culture through the prestige of Paris, then yes, they are profoundly French. Origins and identities are not the same thing. History becomes much calmer once we stop demanding that they be. The morning moves on. Our imaginary Parisian customer disappears around the corner. The bakery serves another person, then another. Coffee machines hiss in nearby cafes, chairs scrape across pavement, deliveries arrive. Somewhere a tourist photographs breakfast, somewhere else a French commuter eats without photographing anything at all. Both croissants vanish at roughly the same speed, and the crumbs remain. We began tonight with a simple question hidden inside a familiar pastry. Why are croissants not as purely French as they seem? The answer carried us through Vienna, Ottoman legends, coffee houses, royal marriages, Versailles, revolution, 19th century Paris, immigrant entrepreneurship, pastry technique, café culture, tourism, industrialization, and globalization. All that from one crescent. History does this often. Pull gently on an ordinary object and an entire world begins unraveling from it. A spoon, a shoe, a loaf of bread, a button, a cup of tea. Nothing is truly boring once you ask where it came from. Though hopefully, it can still be boring enough to help you sleep. So if your eyes are growing heavy now, there is no need to follow the road any farther. The ovens are warm, the streets outside are quiet. Vienna has faded into the distance, Versailles is dark. The old Paris cafes have closed their doors for the night. Only the bakery remains awake. Somewhere long before dawn, a baker is folding cold butter into dough. Roll, fold, rest. Turn. Again. The same patient rhythm. Outside, almost everyone sleeps. By morning, the trays will be ready. The crescents will rise. Coffee will be poured. And people who know nothing of Ottoman sieges, Austrian kipferl, royal myths, or 19th century bakers will sit down and eat. That is perfectly all right. History does not require us to remember it every morning. It waits quietly inside the things we use, inside the words we speak, inside the recipes we inherit, inside the food we call our own. And perhaps tomorrow, if a croissant appears beside your coffee, you will look at it for just a second longer. Not because it is secretly Austrian, not because France has somehow been pretending, but because the little crescent has done what people have always done. It traveled, it changed, it found a home, then it traveled again. And somewhere along the way, the journey became the tradition. The cafe grows quiet now. Your cup is empty. Only a few golden flakes remain on the white plate. Outside the window, the last street sounds soften into the distance, so leave the crumbs where they are. Let the waiter deal with them in the morning. For now, dim the lights a little further. Settle back into the quiet, and allow Vienna, Paris, old bakeries, muddy roads, palace corridors, and warm ovens to fade gently into the dark. The croissant has finished its journey. And so for tonight have we.